Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first ever Lit in Colour teacher conference held in partnership with Tes. This event is being filmed live, and therefore, if there are any technical problems or disconnections, we will be back as soon as possible. My name is Zahida Nabagarika. I'm Senior Lit in Colour Manager at Penguin Books, and I'm joined by Leslie Nelson Addy, Education Manager at Runnymede Trust. The Lit in Colour campaign was founded between Penguin Books and the Runnymede Trust in 2020 with the aim of supporting UK primary and secondary schools to make the teaching of English literature more inclusive of writers of colour. The first phase of the campaign involved commissioning research with an independent team based at Oxford University's Department of Education, investigating the barriers which currently prevent more books by writers of colour from being taught in the classroom in England. This research found that the key barriers for teachers include a lack of resources, budget, and time, as well as a lack of confidence and knowledge in knowing how to talk about race in the classroom. Overall, this results in a systemic underrepresentation of Black, Asian, and minority ethnic writers in the curriculum that is relative to both their place in contemporary British literary excellence, but also compared to the demographics of the UK classroom.
Since then, Lit in Colour has been focused on bringing together different organisations across the educational sector to help facilitate meaningful change. We want to give direct support to schools and teachers with practical, inspirational, and effective tools and resources. This conference is all about building teacher confidence to talk about what it means to consciously engage with text by writers of colour in the classroom. We will begin with the secondary reflective panel discussion, followed by an in conversation with novelist Bernadine Evaristo and playwright Tanika Gupta. This afternoon, we have a primary reflective panel discussion, followed by an in conversation with novelist Nazneen Ahmed Patuk. Please remember to join the link to the primary session after the break. There will be opportunities to ask questions, so please use the chat function. After each session, a QR code will be shown on screen. Please scan it and enter all your details for a chance to win one of our book bundles. Please also share your thoughts and comments on social media using the hashtag LIC Teacher Conference and tag us at Tes for Teachers and at Penguin UK Books. I'm now going to hand over to Lynette Carr-Armstrong, who is the chair for the secondary reflective panel session. Enjoy.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Lynette Carr-Armstrong, and really looking forward to this session this morning. So welcome to you all. I just want to, just say a little bit about myself. I am a teacher in long-standing English teacher, and I've also worked in advisory and consultancy, Ofsted, that kind of thing. So for many years, and I'm very passionate, obviously, about literature, and in particular literature of diverse cultures. So let's just talk about what this session will be about this morning. The main aim of this reflective session is to explore the internal and external barriers a range of English teachers and leaders have faced and overcome in order to incorporate more texts written by authors of colour in their classrooms and curriculums. Our panellists will share contextual detail about their professional journeys, their schools, as well as the process and their reflections on how they made these changes and the impact these changes have had. So, I would like to introduce you to our panellists, and I'm just going to ask each of them to come in and just say a little bit about themselves. So maybe kick off with Joy.
Morning, everybody. My name is Joy Mbakwe. I am an assistant head teacher at Lillian Baylis Technology College, assistant head teacher for community and culture. If you want to follow me, I am at Miss Mbakwe, Miss Joy Mbakwe on Instagram. Thanks.
Jessica?
Morning, everyone. My name's Jess Tacon. I'm Deputy Head of English at a school in North London. I lead the Right Writing campaign. And if anyone did want to follow me on Instagram as well, I'm at The Right Writing.
And Aisha?
Morning, I'm Aisha Rao. I'm a secondary English teacher at Windsor High School in sixth form in Dudley. And I'm also a member of the NATE Reviewing Literature group, who a few of you are on here today. So, yeah.
Thank you all. And we want this session to be really interactive. So please don't forget to put any additional questions in the chat that we'll come to in the second half. But I'm going to kick off with a question that I'm going to pose to you all. I'm going to ask you to really just share a little bit about your journey engaging with text by authors of colour. And just an additional thing there, was this something you started doing more recently, or something that's gone on throughout your career? And again, just, you know, jump in whenever you feel.
I don't mind starting with this one. So it's actually something that I've been doing since my training year, I would say. And when I was planning sort of for this session, thinking about the questions, I actually remembered that my ITT interview for the interview for my PGC, I actually did like a lesson that was on Langston Hughes and like Kanye West. That might not be as like relevant or like maybe appropriate now actually thinking about it, but like I use some of his lyrics. So that's sort of teaching that I've always been interested in, and it's something that I've done for a long time, because that's the kind of, I suppose, literature and that's always the sort of things that I found with students as well. When I started teaching the classroom in my training year, got the best responses, was the most engaging. So yeah, it's something that I've done for a long time, and always found really important. So it's always been on my agenda, if you like, and particularly teaching as widely as possible within curriculum constraints is something that I'm really passionate about, because I think sometimes, and I know a lot of what this will come up later, the curriculum can be really restrictive. So something that I like basically is things that I like to read, things that like popular culture, lots of popular culture. I tend to use a lot of that with teaching English. I think it's one of the best subjects for it. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Ladies?
So I think I would say that I began my teaching career in what I would deem an institutionally racist school. And in being a school like that as a young Black woman, I definitely felt myself performing in the classroom, performing well, but also performing what I believed could be deemed as professional. I spent a long time distancing myself from very obvious characteristics. So I'm Black, I'm a woman, and I was very young at the time, but I spent a long time trying to distance myself from that. So speaking in a particular way, trying to dress in a particular way. And I found that even though I was doing all of those things, I was still kind of coming up short and experiencing microaggressions anyway, being passed over for promotions. In that school, there weren't any opportunities, there weren't any texts by authors of color, but I was asked to design a scheme of work called Telling Tales. I don't know if you've heard of it, by the AQA Anthology. And in there's a short story called The Invisible Mass at the Black Grove. And it speaks about this girl who's coming over from Jamaica. And I remember reading that story and just being issues like featureism, texturism, colorism just leaping out at me. And at the time, I hadn't taught A-level. I was just an NQT. So I didn't know that I was reading the text through a post-colonial lens. I didn't know I was reading it through my own personal experiences of these things. But when I designed the schemes of work and then it was shared across the department, I realized that I was speaking to something that no one else could speak to. Not that they didn't want to, but they couldn't because they just didn't have the eyes that I had. So I left that school eventually and I became 2IC at another school. And it's 2020 at this point and George Floyd is murdered. And I don't want to go and protest. I don't want to be on social media because everywhere I turn, I'm reminded of the insignificance of Black lives and I'm triggered, for lack of a better word. I just can't cope. But my students are looking to me for the answers, because online lessons were excruciating. They were really, really hard. But I'm trying to teach about a text that has nothing to do with the world essentially crumbling around them. And I think it's in that moment that I pivoted. I stopped being someone who was shying away from being a Black woman, and I began to use my lessons as an opportunity to teach them about what it meant to live in my shoes, and actually what it meant to live in theirs also. And then I became head of department that year, and the basis of my appointment was to overhaul the curriculum in a sense and really try and make it anti-racist. And so my appointment was, I was given the job based on my mission, essentially, and that's kind of been my journey from distancing to being really embracing this kind of work.
That's fantastic. Thank you. And Jessica?
So I trained to be a teacher about 10 years ago now, and in my training it felt very traditional, very canonical. Like it wasn't diverse, it wasn't representative at all, really. And it wasn't until I started teaching in an inner London school about 5 years ago that it became really obvious to me how much was missing in the curriculums, on the exam board specifications, because I'd look at, and this was when, I was just a classroom teacher. I didn't actually have any say in what I was teaching, to be honest. So I'd look at what I was being told to teach, I'd look at the students in front of me, and it wasn't matching up. So that's when, for me, I started not pushing back, but prioritizing a bit more, like making sure that we were serving the next generation, essentially, part of that being the students that were in front of us in the classroom.
Thank you. I mean, it's such a range of experience there. And I do think that, when I think back to the beginning of my career, which started in the sort of early to mid 90s, I think it was a time where there were lots of opportunities, really. And I think it does depend on the context of your school. I mean, I was very lucky to train at a school that had a Black head teacher, and was just a very forward thinking school, really, and very open to, enthusiastic people like myself who wanted to bring everything. And I think there is that, it can seem very constraining, but I think that we do have to carve a path and really think about the things that we want our young people to know. So thank you for that. And I'm going to just move on to our next question. And I'm going to direct this really at Jessica and Aisha. How did you feel when you first started teaching texts written by authors of colour in the classroom?
Do you want to go, Jess, or shall I?
You go first, Aisha,
yeah, okay.
And I'll add on.
I'll let you argue it out.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think I had some confidence, I think, because, like I said, it is something that I've done from day one. But also, I think that in terms of how I felt, I think that confidence came from being a person of colour, I think, being a teacher of colour. And I was always really conscious of my identity as a South Asian English teacher, which is still, rare, I think, particularly in this subject, like, in English as a subject, not just teaching more generally, but I think in that particular subject area, teachers of colour are more rare, I think, in English than other subjects. I know that's something that actually Lit in Colour, the report, even looked at, that, teachers of colour in terms of subject area is quite an interesting thing to think about in itself. So I know I can't speak, although, I had that confidence, so I can't speak from all experience. My experience was particular to me, being, Asian and female. But I also think one of the things, I suppose, with when I started teaching at the school I'm currently at, which I started out about 5 years ago, in the area of Dudley that I live in, that has a particularly strong, the regional aspect was really important there in terms of that confidence. And like Jess actually just said, serving the community that the school was in. So the school I'm in currently we have a really high Yemeni Arabic population in the local area. It's actually one of the highest in the Midlands. So the sorts of texts and authors that I kind of researched or read about tended to be Muslim or Arabic. So I found some local poets who were from that background. and I'd kind of seek out texts that sort of reflected those students and kind of made them, feel like that they were seen, and that kind of felt quite important to do that in particular as well. And that kind of, I suppose, fed into that confidence further. So yeah, that's something I would say in terms of how I started. When I started teaching authors of colour. But again, I would say that is within curriculum constraints. There aren't any of those on our curriculum, so that is as and when I could fit it in. That was me in my own classroom, so that wasn't like it wasn't a sort of departmental thing.
Yeah, so I'll just add on to that. I think I'll speak here about when I first started teaching entire texts by authors of colour, so like entire poetry collections, entire novels, entire plays, because I think for a long time when we talk about racial representation, it's often just been like poems and poetry collections. And this is something, Joy, that you sort of mentioned earlier with the telling tales, I think was short stories, wasn't it? And obviously just reading one poem like that's not like an in-depth look at something, is it? So I think when I first started really in-depth teaching of authors of colour, as I said earlier, I was in a very racially diverse school. I still am. I think there was, and this is something we hear a lot, I think for me there was a bit of a fear that, because I care about the students I'm teaching, a fear that I was going to misrepresent, or I was going to say the wrong thing, or I was going to harm them in some way. But then that fear is then, and Aisha just spoke about, serving the community you're teaching. That fear then was for me taken over by a necessity to I guess serve the students that I'm teaching. And that's not to say that race is the only way that we engage with text and we relate to each other. But if you're ignoring certain racial identities, you're definitely communicating the message to those students that certain races are bad or should be marginalized. And that's in any classroom. That's not just in, a racially diverse classroom. And I'd say with regards to that fear that teachers can feel, and I felt that as well, that nothing is perfect when you start doing something properly. That doesn't mean that you just go with the flow and see what happens. Obviously, we're teachers, we plan ahead. But I think as long as you're going in with kindness and understanding, and I suppose as well like a willingness to give up some of your power as an educator, then that fear just dissipates, and it's replaced with that feeling that like, yeah, I am actually doing my job, and I'm making these children in front of me feel celebrated and feel like they matter and feel seen and feel like that English as a subject is a place for them. And obviously that links to so many things like Aisha just said with teachers as well, and like the teacher workforce. So
Thank you. I think that question starts to really feed into one of the things that I did want to ask you about was about actually the themes of teaching racism. And what I'm going to do is, because I think you started to sort of touch on that, so I'm going to go to Joy, and I'm going to really ask you, Joy, about how you can really overcome the challenges of teaching about race and racism, and what sort of challenges you perhaps have faced. And again, in your in your introduction, you started to talk in our first question, you did start to talk about that, but I'd be interested to hear and then circle back to the others.
Sure. I think the first kind of challenge that I face is that I'm not a bystander. This isn't an issue that isn't intimately connected to my identity. When I'm in staff training, because my staff is my school body are doing so much to try and just kind of get on board with what's happening around the world and make sure that we're all seen. But there are moments where they speak about how difficult it is for Black women to achieve. And I'm sitting there thinking, Do they know that they're speaking about me and my life? And I, in a professional setting, do not want to be confronted with the realities and all the barriers I've had to overcome. I think that if you're in a personal setting and you're speaking about race relations, you can lament, you can grieve with fellow people that look like you. But these children, some of them look like me, some of them don't. But my words carry weight, they have consequence. So I must be measured, I must be balanced. I can't allow something so personal that is being explored in a professional sense, in a professional place, to be, mishandled by me. I think the second challenge is the tenderness with which it needs to be handled as well. It's not just my life; it's their lives as well. I remember when I was teaching Sign of the Four, one of my students, a black boy, said to me, "Miss, why is the only person of color in the text shot and killed without speaking?" And George Floyd has just been murdered. So he's asking me, Miss, why do I have to be reminded in such an aggressive way in the classroom that you say is safe by you, a black woman, that I don't really matter? What do I say to that? How do I tenderly make sure that this young man isn't harmed further by my teaching of this text? And the last thing that I think the last challenge that I think kind of came up for me was this innocence that's lost. I am their teacher. I love my students dearly. I don't want to rid them of this innocence that comes with understanding the injustices that plague the world. You want to shield your children from from the monsters that are out under the bed. And here I am saying, hey, this is what it means to be black. This is what it means to live in our society. There is that loss that I'm taking from it. And even though I'm giving them the language to empower, I'm giving them the language to speak about their experiences, because even though I may feel as though I'm ridding them of their innocence, my children have been in institutions that have not acknowledged them appropriately since they were children, since they were primary school. I remember I asked my students, when did you realize that you couldn't use slang in the classroom? When did you realize that the way that you spoke was something that was for there and not for here, and you had to kind of censor yourself here? And they said, Miss, I don't know, primary school? And I said, okay, this has been happening for a long time. So yes, I'm empowering them, but I'm giving them the language, but I'm also ridding them of that innocence that I don't want to do. In terms of overcoming it, a few things. I think vulnerability and honesty, as you can probably tell, I do speak very from a place, from the places that I've experienced. I try not to distance myself from them, and I speak honestly to about what it means to live in my shoes, what it means to live in this world. Um, a willingness to listen. I think, Jessica, you touched on this as well. I think that sometimes as teachers, we can be quite prideful. We teach from the highest place of authority, so we believe that we have all the answers. But I have never been stopped and searched by the police, but my children have, my students have. So when they speak about that, I must become the listener. I must allow them to speak about what that means in a way that doesn't mean I can't end the conversation when I'm ready and say, and this is the lesson that we've learned. I can't do that. You teach me. And I guess that's linked to my final point, which is I think it's really important to learn about when you are facilitator, when you're teacher, and when you're learner, and you're moving between those. Sometimes you sit back, I'm here to learn. Sometimes I'm here to facilitate. What do you think? What do you think? And sometimes I'm bringing it all together and saying, this is the lesson that we can, this is how we move forward. And I think those are the kind of challenges, and that's how I've overcome them.
Thank you. And ladies, I don't know if you wanted to come in there and just really kind of comment about, how you would approach teaching race, building on what sort of Joy has said there. Does any of that resonate as something that has been shared or that comes from you?
I think Joy's put it pretty eloquently, to be honest. I don't know what I'd add. I would just say, just that like what you said at the end, Joy, about considering what your role is. Is it, what did you say? Facilitator, teacher, listener, and marrying that up with, okay, who's in front of me in the classroom? What am I teaching? What narrative is being presented here? How do I make sure that what is being taught and the way I'm teaching it is not harming these students? It's just a lot of consideration. It's a lot of consideration and planning ahead, not just like if you know that, say, okay, today we're going to get to this chapter in this book where this potentially like traumatic event happens, say, and it's to do with racism, like planning ahead, not just going in and thinking, oh, I'll see how it goes, like thinking, how am I going to be considerate about this, and how am I going to make sure those students feel safe? And like you said, Joy, that they feel, your students obviously feel able to talk to you and question you and be open with you. Like, how am I going to make sure that they feel able to do that in the classroom?
Sure.
Yeah, I was going to say it's been covered really well, actually, the answer to the question already. I think almost on the reverse side, so as well as with engaging students and responding to students' questions when they have them, I think something that it's not actually something that I have an answer to. It's probably a question that I'm throwing back. Is that I've kind of had, I suppose, the challenge that I've had is when some students can become really reserved and inward, and I think they can almost lose confidence, and there's a lot of worry that they might say the wrong thing. I think when race is brought up in the classroom, and maybe it might depend on obviously where you're teaching or what kind of students you've got, who you've got in front of you. But that's something that I've noticed as well with classes is, and again, I don't know, I'm kind of asking this back to you all, but how to overcome that. I think with creating that safe space obviously is a starting point, but I think sometimes students can get very almost like, I suppose, not contribute, or kind of maybe turn a bit inward, and because they're worried about saying the wrong thing in those discussions as well. So I think I suppose that's something I'm still working on, actually, just thinking about how to overcome that for those students. So I don't know if anyone's got anything to say on that actually as a solution, because that's still something that I'm not as sure about myself.
I think it is about, creating an environment where, everybody feels that they can input, that there are kind of some ground rules, but that, you're really interested in what everybody has to say, and everybody, there's no intention to offend. It's really about exploring so that you can learn. And I think as a teacher, you do have to be able to, you know, ask the questions and create the space for people to come in and, direct the questions in such a way so that it isn't so loaded, and it is at their, where they're at, but drawing them to where, will be a better place to be. And I definitely think that, that actually focusing on cultural aspects as well is really important, because it's not, to focus on uh, racism is negative, and it's very stressful, and it can be very stressful for everybody, and it also pigeonholes people who experience racism, that is their only experience and the only thing that defines who they are, where they come from, where those characters might come from. And I think that we need to spend more time looking at other aspects of what it is to be Black, or a person of colour, or from a different culture, and the richness that brings, whether it is through language or through practices, all of those sorts of things. So I think that is the work that we have to do as teachers. And I was going to ask Jessica, really, just again in terms of like how you build confidence in being able to teach and introduce these kinds of aspects into the classroom and with students.
I mean, this is going to be shocking from an English teacher, but read a lot and research a lot. And I think the more that all teachers are doing this, genuinely doing it, the less we'll have the need to explicitly discuss books by authors of colour as if they're separate from literature on a wider level. And when I say read, I don't just mean, the text that we're going to teach. This has been mentioned a lot already, but really considering how are you going to teach those texts to the students in your classes. And I know that, for example, the Runnymede Trust, I know that, and Leslie, you'll have to correct me if I get the title of this wrong, but they have a document which is called Race and Racism in English Secondary Schools. Did I get that right? And for example, that looks at more of like a school-wide level. And I think documents like that are really important to consider the bigger picture, I guess, of what we're teaching, because sometimes we can get, as teachers, we have so many things that we're told to focus on, from Ofsted, SLT, school priorities, and it can be a lot. So just, I think we don't have a lot of time. Teachers are very time poor, but really carving out the time where you can to read up and to come back to that word consideration, consider how you're best going to teach the texts. And yeah, I guess I just finished by saying that the only thing that you change should not be the texts on your curriculum. Because that's a part of it. If you're just doing that, you're just shoehorning in something different. You're not actually embedding it and making sure that that it's purposeful, and that it helps the students that you're teaching.
Thank you for that. I'm going to just move us on a little bit, and I'm going to ask Aisha a question here, just about what other resources you have used to make your learning and teaching around diverse authors and cultures more effective and inspirational.
So much. So this like leads on nicely from Jess's, actually, because like one of them is read widely. So reading is one of the things that I've done, obviously, and obviously reading writers from diverse backgrounds is one of the things. I think specifically teaching about making like teaching and learning inspirational and effective. One of the things I did want to touch on was school visits, actually, and from just thinking about the end of this year, the academic year we've just had at school, we had a visit at my school from Suhaima Manzoor Khan, who was brilliant. So again, if you haven't read any of, she's a poet. She's Muslim, wears a hijab. She was, again, thinking about my particular demographic at our school. It was absolutely incredible to have her in school. And what was again particularly inspirational about this visit that we had, and we were very lucky to be able to do that again. Budgets and things come into that, because those things can be expensive to have author visits, but author visits is such a great way of making this inspirational, is actually to hear from these writers, or hearing from writers of color. And we were really lucky in that we were able to, we targeted students. We made it for girls only in year 10, which we thought was really important, because girls, we sort of wanted it to be like a confidence for the girls sort of thing, and we actually targeted the students that we got English teachers to nominate the students that they wanted to put forward for the visit. She did a workshop with them, a creative workshop, and when we had the girls in the room and I gave them a little invite to tell them, this is what you've been invited to, this is who's coming, and they were, two of the girls in my classroom sat right by my desk were like, she's Muslim, like straight away. Like two of the girls who again wear hijabs themselves, and that's what it's all about. That was so important. They were so and it wasn't just Muslim girls that went, it was the whole English department nominated their year 10 girls from their year 10 classes, and we had a real mix. But it was really important for those girls, I think, in particular, to have her come in. And she's a really powerful speaker. She's an educator as well. She's very radical, and I think that's great. She's very outspoken, and that's so important for those girls, actually. So one thing I would say is actually, school visits, target students, that can be so inspirational and so powerful. So that was just from personal experience more recently. Also making the learning, you could, cross-curricular. So you could look at, making ties in with like history. That's, your other departments are a great resource. So, finding out or observing your history colleagues, how do they teach empire? If you're not confident, you could definitely go and do that. That's something that I've done before. I've even found out in the last couple of years that actually, I think it's A-level PE or some aspect, a qualification on PE, I've forgotten. They teach about empire in PE. So for one of their, I think it's the A-level, but don't quote me on that because I'm not an expert. So they even, you could ask actually other subject areas. They do actually cover these things. So it's worth finding out. And then you can maybe make those connections with students as well who, in other subjects. I also think, again, using popular culture, that's one of my like big things. So I love using Stormzy. He's one of my absolute favourite people. So I tend to, he pops up in my lessons a lot. And picture books that connect. So picture books are a great way in actually to a lot of topics. There's lots of picture books on that are very, very powerful that you can use. There's actually one that I've got called The Roots of Rap, which I've used before, that tells the history of sort of rap and hip hop, where it started in New York, and that's a great one for introducing like African American poetry. So yeah, there's so much out there. Attend lots of CPD. The Globe do anti-racist Shakespeare CPD. The British Library, Nate as well, obviously do lots of CPD. Lit Drive, lots of them provide new ways of teaching old texts actually. And actually the Nate group that Jess and Leslie and I are part of, we're developing a teacher resource as well, that is going to have, for further nonfiction reading, it's going to have a whole list of recommended nonfiction reading for teachers. So look out for that. That'll be coming soon. So yeah, I feel like I've thrown a lot out there, and I think that wasn't too much, but yeah, there's
thank
loads.
you. That's fantastic. I hope you've all got your pens at the ready and have been noting all of that down. I'm going to ask Joy to sort of expand on that in some ways, but just think about non-fiction texts, interesting non-fiction texts you've read to develop your own practice, and what impact did these texts have on your knowledge and understanding of race-related issues? And obviously you've talked about sort of George Floyd already, so just kind of if you could sort of share that and give people more things to note down.
Sure, of course. Before I respond to that question, actually, you posed a question that was really kind of like resonated with me about how do I respond to students who become inward and reserved. And I think it's something that I've also observed in staff. And I know some of you who are attending this conference actually are going back to schools that perhaps you have that tendency, or you observe it in staff when you do want to speak about these things. People don't outwardly say that they're not in favor of it, but you sense that the mood in the room shifts. And I just thought I'd give some kind of tips as to how to kind of do that in the classroom and in these kind of CPD training. I think the first thing you want to do is kind of make sure you're planning any questions you want to explore, planning those ahead. Make sure you're doing that. Break off into small groups where possible. People are really shy to speak about. They're really scared of saying the wrong thing, and it's understandable. Racism is a really kind of like word that's quite stigmatized. So small groups, paired work, and students and teachers alike, split them up, give them opportunities to explore these questions that you've thought about. If you can have kind of groups that are more aligned, so maybe you can pair people together, maybe someone who's a bit more talkative than somebody else. Circulate the room if you can, and then spotlight. And that way you would have given them the confidence to have been able to kind of talk about, build their confidence with the person they're kind of peer. And then when you spotlight, then you give them the opportunity to begin to build their confidence out loud. And I think these kind of things are things I just thought about really quickly that I think can help in the classroom and in your staff CPD. Sorry, to answer your question that you actually posed. The first book I read a book this summer actually, and it's called The Pain We Carry, and it was recommended to me by one of the people that I line manage. It's a book that I didn't know that I needed to read. I, in some ways, had become quite tired of talking about race, not because it doesn't matter, but because it is so heavy. And there are moments in the text that she speaks about. It's called The Pain We Carry. Sorry, I don't know if I mentioned that. And she speaks about the way that race informs everything. And I think as a person of color, I'm often accused of playing the race card. I don't know what the race card is, but when I say it, you all kind of know, what I'm talking about. Like, as though, you're almost afraid to say, this is my experience, because you're afraid of the institution and the people within it. But The Pain We Carry talks about the way that, potentially my father, as an immigrant, as a refugee, as someone who survived the war, has come over to this country, how he's had to navigate the 1970s Britain, and that pain, that trauma of going through that experience has informed the way that he reared me, and how I now carry that. And what does that mean for me? What does that mean for my classroom? And I think in reading that book, it's given me an empathy that I didn't have for myself, and an empathy that I can now carry into the classroom for my students and their parents. What does it mean when you have parents who don't look like you, who may not be able to speak to you in the language that they're struggling to comprehend? They want their child to do well, but they don't know where to begin. What can I give them? How can I extend that empathy that I now have for myself and my father? That's the first book. The second book is called White Fragility. I think it's quite well known. I think at times people are more offended about being called a racist than racism itself. And I think this book is really good and quite powerful in the sense that it allows you to understand that being kind or being good and being racist are not mutually exclusive. You can be a good person and be racist. You can be kind to people and still be racist. And it's really important that we begin to understand that until we begin to unpick and unpack what has been handed to us, i.e., our perceptions of what is beauty, what does it mean to be able, what does it mean to be intelligent, what does it mean to be beautiful? All of these things are ideas that have been handed to us. We need to unpack these things, and I think white fragility allows us to center, the work that needs to be done, as opposed to the tenderness and the fragility that often arises when we speak about racism. So those are the two books that I've read that have kind of allowed me to continue on with the work I'm doing.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thanks so much for that. I'm going to ask Aisha and Jessica. And again, I mean, there's so many overlaps in what we're talking about today, but it's just to drill down a little bit. So there is often an expectation that the literature written by authors of colour ought to be positive, uplifting, to challenge the more common narrative of suffering. Now, I've said that I do think that it is important to have that balance. What is your perspective on this, and how do you ensure the learning and teaching of text by authors of colour have a sense of hope and optimism, while at the same time addressing themes like racism, trauma, and oppression?
Do you want me
Aisha?
to go, Aisha?
Yeah,
You
you
go,
go
Aisha.
on. Yeah. Are you
Okay.
sure? Go on.
Yeah,
You go,
you go first.
Okay. So I mean, I would say it is about balance. I think it is all about balance with this. It's a difficult question. I think it's one that comes up a lot in these conversations, and it's completely understandable as well, because what I would say is that a lot of YA young adult fiction, it is actually issues focused. They are very issues focused anyway. And believe it or not, that is often a lot of what students do want to read about. Lots of YA fiction is classically very kind of issues focused and deals with that, this kind of coming of age thing. So I would start with that. I'd also say that the humour market is growing. I think there's lots of texts by writers of colour now, and books by writers of colour that are like very humorous. So I've read a few recently that are much kind of funnier, and they're kind of that area of that market with writers of colour but writing funny books, that's also growing. So it's worth looking into that. And you could that's part of that balance, having those texts in your library, recommending those texts to kids, not always having, I suppose they might not necessarily be on your curriculum, they might not be literary, the funny texts in that sense in terms of studying, but that's definitely part of that balance, I think. And I think when maybe teaching texts, I suppose, that are maybe like we've said, traumatic or on these quite difficult themes, so addressing those themes but also instilling that sense of hope and optimism, it's making it with your teaching maybe more solutions focused, looking to a more hopeful future. So what could you offer in terms of a solution to it? It's hard because we're talking really broadly here rather than about a particular text, but how could we look to a more hopeful future? And one example that I would use, it's not one that I've taught, but it's one that I read just a couple of months ago for the Cheltenham Festival panel, which I'm on. And it's called The Roles We Play by Saba Khan. It's a graphic novel. They are going to be using it so Cheltenham Festival use it for Key Stage 3, actually. It is very, it's about sort of second, third generation immigrant trauma. It's about, she's writing, it's autobiographical essentially, Saba Khan's kind of upbringing in a South Asian Muslim household in Britain, but she writes about the kind of trauma and that kind of really heavy shadow of empire. It's a fantastic graphic novel. I would recommend it to anyone. It really connected with me. And it is going to be used in schools. And what I would say on one thing is it ends hopefully. It ends on a real moment of hope, which is great. It is very she does talk about moments of depression. She's an architect, so going to university, going into that very male dominated kind of industry. She writes about that, getting into university, these kind of really white institutions. All of that is in there, and that's something that I related with a lot. What I would say with that graphic novel is that it's a book that I wish I'd read when I was a teenager, and it's one that I've since recommended to my sisters, and it's one that I found really, really powerful. So I wish I'd read that at that age. And so what I would say is that I would have felt really seen reading that at that age. So yes, Ensure Hope and Optimism, and it is a book that ends hopefully, but don't underestimate what an acknowledgement of a struggle can do as well, because that was her struggle, and that would have really like spoken to me, I think, at that age. So yes, it is very traumatic in a way, that story, but that acknowledgement of that struggle would have meant a lot to me then as well. So it is about balance. I think there's two sides to that. Definitely. So the acknowledgement of the struggle is important as well. I hope that it's a difficult question to answer, so I'm gonna stop there. I hope that's yeah. Thank you.
Jessica?
Yeah, I can add on. I mean, I think you've put that really well, Aisha, and it is a difficult question. I think a lot of what we're talking about with this question is diversity, I guess, which I don't always love that word, because I think it can be used in a very like tokenistic way. But if we're talking about diversity, diverse narratives, diversity literally means varied. It means a variety. And we are teaching any writer, but we're teaching authors of colour to move away from them being marginalised, which historically has happened and is still happening now. But if we don't show balanced narratives, as Aisha has just said, within that, I guess we're just misrepresenting rather than underrepresenting in a way. And no group is a monolith, if you like. The only thing that authors of colour have in common is that they are not white. So if, say, we're talking in terms of curriculum, as has been mentioned quite a lot, we need to look in a bigger picture sort of way. We need to look in its entirety at the narratives that we are presenting. And as Aisha has already said and given some great examples there, making sure that it is varied and making sure that it is not just one thing that we're showing students.
I completely agree. I think that that there is such a range, and I think yes, we have a national curriculum and all of those sorts of things, but I still think within that you can constrain yourself as a teacher, really, and use that as something that constrains you. And actually there is a lot of I've never felt there isn't, when I've been teaching and working with teachers, I just feel that the ceiling is just not there. There is a lot that I can actually do, and it is about really sort of understanding that we do have an opportunity to expand the horizons of young people. And I'm going to ask Joy really how you bring parents on board with that. So this question is really about how parents and students have contributed to your learning and teaching of text written by authors of colour.
Sure. So students have always been at the heart of everything that I've sought to do. Questions I ask myself are, why this text? Why now at this point in their lives? And why them? And I think there was a point at which my 2IC, when I was head of department, wanted to teach our students like some gothic genre, a kind of a text. And I kept asking her, like, why them? Why do they need to know this? Does it prepare them for the GCSE? What does it do for these particular students? And eventually she began to understand that ultimately we are here to serve the students in front of us. And I teach in a Black majority school, so that informs what I do. But I do think that even if you work in a white majority school or whatever majority school, you still need to prepare them to be citizens of the world. So if you are faced with students who are all white, they still need to understand what it means to be, I guess the word diverse, or what it means to be inclusive. So why them? Why this? Why now? When I became head of department, we had a really good curriculum, but it wasn't inclusive and it wasn't anti-racist. So I spent that year deciding that I wanted to make that happen. And that involved working long hours. It involved having really difficult conversations with staff and students to figure out what we had not been doing and what we needed to do. And then once I'd finished that work, when we were rolling it out, I was very clear on the people who also were designing the schemes of work alongside me that we're not just doing this to tick a box. If the students say this doesn't speak to me or this makes me feel uncomfortable, that is valuable information, and we want them to be part of it. I think when I ask their opinions, like, did it work? Or in their words, did it bang? And they say to me, it did, or it didn't bang, miss, it didn't bang, miss, don't do that again. You have to, you take it on board and you move forward and then you include them. And I think that in terms of with parents, you have to understand that the effects of colonialism are very far reaching. Parents value Shakespeare above all else, actually. They want their children to know Shakespeare, but we also want their children to know Shakespeare. We want their children to know Shakespeare and lots of other stories as well. So I think because we begin with the students go home and report back on English. They say, we love English. We really like our teacher. We really like what they're doing in English. They're trying to do this, mum. They're trying to do this, dad. And I think that buy-in that happens at home allows us to have intentional and critical conversations with the parents, but we're also having to broaden their expectations about what their children learn. But because students are at the heart of it, they teach me, I teach them, and there's this beautiful exchange of energy and information in the classroom because of that.
That's I think it's just really encouraging to hear. Now, I also thought when you were talking there, Joy, just about this opportunity to share with colleagues, and how, as teachers, the three of you in different positions within your schools and what have you, really just how you use that agency to really spread this so that students can have these conversations across classrooms, in the playground, that it isn't just something that's happening in your class. So I'm just going to throw that out to all of you, really, to think about, like, how you really spread the love. Jessica, go on, share. Tell me.
I'll go. I think it depends on your role in the school, in all honesty. Like, I can speak from my experience that so I'm 2IC, the English department, but I'm in charge of Key Stage 3 English. So it would be that, I guess, working department wide to make sure that as a department, we have a shared goal. And like I said earlier, if I am saying, we're going to teach this text now, this is going to be on our curriculum, as Joy said earlier, why are we adding that text on the curriculum? What do we need to prioritize in our teaching approaches when we're teaching this text? And just being really, I think a lot of what we do as teachers, how do I put it, is that you really prepare and you really plan ahead and you really do your homework. But in the classroom, the students can't tell that. It all feels very organic and it feels like you've just thrown it together, seeing how it goes. And obviously that's why English teaching is beautiful. So I think it's just finding that balance. To give just one really brief example, a couple of years ago, I decided that as an English department, we would stop teaching Of Mice and Men in Year 8, and instead we would teach Minty Alley by C.L.R. James, which, if anyone does want to teach it, there's some really, really good resources for it on the Lit in Colour website as well. And just a couple of things that I did when we were teaching that to make sure it was joyful and that students enjoyed it, and to come back to that word, that students felt safe when they were learning it. I created, because it was quite a long book, I created a booklet of extracts, and I made sure that each extract, where necessary, had trigger warnings. I made sure those were on the lesson plans. I made sure, as I briefly mentioned earlier, that the teachers who were going to be teaching that book were aware of that and why we were doing that and how to approach that. So I think it's just planning ahead, I would say, to make sure that the actual lessons themselves can be as fruitful and joyful as possible. So doing the work ahead of time to allow that to happen.
Anyone else want to come in on that? It's just
Sure.
that thing of, you know, like using your power and, you know, your knowledge to really infuse and share across the department. This is something that I'm often asked in terms of, like, you know, so that it isn't just a resource that, you know, is just, you know, going to be in your classroom, that it is shared across departments. And I know lots of departments do work like that and beyond as well, you know. So I'm, you know, in my work in terms of advisory and consultancy work, you know, I get to do that a lot, but much of that starts from what you do as a teacher within your school. So
Sure. So I think that I don't want NQTs and classroom teachers new to the classroom to be discouraged. There is power that you have in the classroom. I think
mm,
children are very powerful in terms of spreading what you do. So if you commit, even if it's small change, even if it can't be the change that you would like to see eventually, having those kind of moments where you speak about, if you are still teaching of mice of men, what Crooks goes through and why he perpetuates the very system that oppresses him, and teaching from a place of great empathy, your children will carry that. Their feet are faster than yours and quicker than yours. They will carry that around the school. I think for me, as I moved, I guess, through the ranks, as the two I see, as I mentioned, when George Floyd was murdered, I did create lessons that kind of spoke about privilege and what it meant. When I was appointed as head of department, one of the questions that I did ask in interview to the people who were going to join my team was, what was your personal and professional response to this moment that essentially stopped the world? And the basis of their appointment, alongside their teaching, alongside how students responded to them, was what they did as well. Because I need to make sure that when I'm bringing you into this classroom, you are not going to cause harm to these children. If you don't care about what happened, that is fine. But that means that you don't really care about what's going to be happening to these children in this classroom, because their lives are mirrors. There are so many parallels between their lives and what happens to them on the streets of London, unfortunately. Um, I think running training as well, and making sure that whenever I would attend training as head of department, so if there was free training available, I would go. I would invite other people to come alongside me. I would then run training to make sure that this information was being disseminated. And as assistant head teacher in this new role, I'm really thinking about student leadership and making sure that we have opportunities for students to go and do that training and bring it back to the school. So I think at every level you can create change, and I don't want anyone to feel discouraged, because I know that definitely I thought, when I become, head of department, and it doesn't, you don't have to wait until then. There are going to be moments where you can read the text in a different way. I think everybody's spoken about the reading that you can do. And if you are making those changes inwardly, you are going to begin to ask those questions off the back of your reading. You take that to your department and you just keep like kind of plodding along, keep kind of like banging on the door and saying, this is what I think, this is what I think. And eventually, even if it's just to keep you quiet, they'll give you something.
yeah, definitely. I'm going to just move us over now to our Q&A, because we have quite a few questions that have been posed. So I'm just going to kind of just go through them and throw them. I won't ask all of you to input on every question, but if you really feel that you want to dive in, please do. And if we have that kind of pregnant pause, then I will just pick on you. Okay. And then you can bounce it back. Right, so the first one, which is quite interesting actually, because I do remember teaching this. A teacher has said they are apprehensive about teaching Beloved with its bleak and traumatic themes. So do any of the panelists have advice for her? And I'm just going to quickly come in before any of you do, if you have used this. One of the things that I didn't teach the whole text, but I remember teaching, a long time ago, you'd go into these stock cupboards and you'd have some really odd books. Okay. And one of the things that everybody used to love teaching was this book called Underground to Canada. And it was about these two girls who didn't want to be slaves anymore, so they ran away. Very, very simplistic. But what you can do with all of that as a teacher is just, immense. And what I got these kids to dig into was, yes, this is very simplistic, and there's this horrible theme of slavery, and it's you know, kind of just that you don't want to be a slave anymore, you can just run off. And one of the things I did was compare it to an extract from Beloved. Now these were only year 8s, so it was an extract that really showed that part where, you know, she can't think of anything worse than her baby having to grow up as a slave, and she, you know, she unalives her baby. And what that did for those kids was that it made them have that contrast, and for them to be able to see those differences between what is the reality and how you can be introduced to the reality through something more simplistic, be able to take it somewhere else, and for those kids to go off and want to read that themselves. So I think there are, you know, there are different ways that you can enter into something that is quite heavy, and I'll just throw that over to you all if any of you want to just come in on that. No. No, do you think I've said enough there, do you? All right, I've got one on of Mice and Men, and I know obviously we're all getting a sight of these questions. So Joy, I'm going to throw this at you. A teacher has asked, what are the main issues with teaching of Mice and Men?
Sure. So I read of Mice and Men when I was a teaching assistant. So I read it later than everybody else. I think my year group, we read To Kill a Mockingbird. So I'd missed of Mice and Men. And I remember sitting in the classroom. I would have been maybe about 22 at the time. And I remember reading ahead because I was like, this text is amazing. Wow. And then George, Lenny, I couldn't believe the ending, right? I was heartbroken. So I actually couldn't wait to teach it, right? When I got into the classroom. But then, as I was reading the text, as when I was a bit older and I was having to teach it, I realized that Curly's wife didn't have a name. Lenny is, we think he's disabled, but is he disabled? Not really told. And then Crooks's ending is Crooks doesn't really have an Crooks doesn't have a name and like an ending. He's like he's also has a disability, but he's also kind of like he's treated really badly. He's used the N-word is used to describe him throughout the book. And the question I had to ask myself is, yes, the text is about immigration and belonging and about this dream. But what else is being communicated to my students? What is it saying about what it means to be a woman? You know, red, the connotations of red and Curly's wife and women, and what happens to her is very, very dark. What happens to Lenny is also dark. There is more that happens in the text that is bad to the characters than is good, if we're going to be honest. And in a space, in the time we're in now, we have to be very careful when our students are being exposed. I don't know if any of you have been on TikTok, but people actually just go on there and just talk. They just put the camera on, they just speak, and our students are consuming this at an alarming rate. They spend hours. I'm speaking during lockdown. Some of them said my students reported that they were spending 18 hours a day on their phones, and so we have to really be careful about what we are contributing to the conversation. Are we moving the conversation forward? And I think at times, as an English classroom, our conversations are very much in the past. What are we saying about Curly's wife? What are we saying about women? Unless you are framing the text and saying, actually, I'm going to treat this text as a kind of like a springboard for activism. So we're going to speak about women's rights. We're going to speak about the rights of people who are not considered able. We're going to speak about the rights of like Black people. Unless you're doing it like that is, I would say, go for it, because I think that it's a meaty text to get into. But if you make it about the American dream and what it means to belong, they don't belong, and they're rejected by their society, and 2 of them die. I think as a society, as a school and as a society, we've moved on from a place where that is the end of the story. If you want to continue the narrative, continue in a way that empowers our students, doesn't leave them with more questions than answers. And I think that is why personally I decided not to teach of Mice and Men to my students moving forward.
Okay, that's interesting. I've got another question here that just talks really about asks about the use of the N-word in older texts like of Mice and Men and Roll of Thunder. and what approaches you all might use in the classroom when you come across negative language. Aisha?
Yeah, actually, that's something that Mice and Men is a text that I've taught before as well. And there's always a lesson on about the issue with the M word. There's always a lesson that I've done before we read. I think it first mentioned in chapter 2. Before we get to that chapter about the M word, there's a brilliant. I think it is a BBC article actually. So I think one of the things when we talked about resources is find good resources that are really reliable. The BBC tends to be really good. Those sorts of resources are quite good actually to use for teaching. There's lots of BBC Teach resources that are really strong on these areas that, you know, really are very clear. So there's a BBC article called the History of the M Word that I always use with students, and we read it together, and then I get them to answer a couple of questions. And essentially, it kind of gives them a bit of a potted history of the use of it. So origins of slavery, the reclaiming of it, maybe in the 20th century, the use of it by rappers, and what, you know. So it's really kind of, they find it really engaging and interesting. So that's a great baseline. So I'd recommend that. I think if you just type in BBC, the history of the M word, it'll come up, and it's a very accessible article. So that's one resource I would say that I would use. That's a great approach with it. I've always had with students just an agreement that we obviously don't say it. So when we've read of Mice and Men, it's actually always been quite powerful. Students like to read aloud, so they'll read section chapters. When they come to it, they'll either just pause, some of them replace it with black, some of them just say M word. So, and actually, it's been, whenever there's just been like a pause, that's actually been quite powerful, I think. So there's different ways, but I would say, yeah, we've always agreed, or we've always set that ground rule that we won't say it. This word is in the book, we won't say it. And actually, it's funny because I'm planning at the minute to teach this, and the M word's actually in this as well. So punch in the air. So that's one that I'm planning to teach in the coming term. So it still exists even in, I suppose, you know, more modern texts, including those older ones as well. So it's, you know, just something to think about. So yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to just there's loads of questions. It's really good. So here's another one. Do any of the panel have any suggestions on approaching all white classrooms with these themes? Can any of you throw any light on that? I'll quickly just come in and say, I mean, I've worked at the beginning of the 2000s. I went to work as an advisor in Thurrock, which at the time was a very monocultural area, and over the years it's changed. And I do think that you know, there was a lot of work to do with teachers in terms of, like, you know, introducing more cultural texts, being more on point with the texts that were already in the curriculum, things at GCSE and so on and so forth. And I do think one of the most important things that we did was to talk about, to have the space to actually talk and to share about those things. And I was often the only Black person in that space, and my main aim is I want honesty. Really, I want honesty, and I'm not going to be apologetic about sharing my ideas or the things that I think that young people need to know and be exposed to, in the way that everyone has an opinion and ideas that that they want to share, and is within a framework of a curriculum and so on and so forth. So that would be where I come from, but I would love to hear any advice that you have to share on that. And I know, Joy, you touched on this about how important it is, regardless of whether, you know, it's a mixed, you know, group, or it is, like, you know, just monocultural, what have you. So please come in there.
Sure. I think we have to understand that racism is it's a really bad word. It's really stigmatized, and people are often offended. I think, as a Black person, I don't know when I became aware that I was Black. I don't know that moment. I can't remember. I do remember me reading the Noughts and Crosses and thinking, oh my goodness, she is like me, and I have not seen this before. So perhaps it was then. I was probably about 10. I remember running around the playground with a hood on my head my coat on my head to try and make my hair long. So I think I was aware that my hair didn't flow in the way that other people's. So I guess I'm using this to demonstrate that my awareness of my blackness is just always been there. Whereas I think white people often aren't confronted with the reality that they are white. It's only when it's in kind of relation to somebody else and they're saying, oh, you've done something to me, or this is happening in the world and it's because of race. And if race has never been an issue to you, you just can't understand why it's ridiculous. Why would somebody judge you on the basis of your skin? You can't control that. It is ridiculous, but it is real and it does happen. And I think that the first thing in my head, just kind of quickly going through, I think with pushback, you will face pushback from the parents. That is I think that's inevitable because they think it's rude to talk about racism, and they do not think that school should be politicized, even though they are, right? But they're very against it. So I think that one thing that I would try and do is lead with empathy. I would choose a text. I know Noughts and Crosses is spoken about a lot, but I think texts like that, texts that really invite conversations around what it means to be different, to live in a world where you are judged for things that you cannot control. And this doesn't have to be limited to race. I think in those kind of schools, there needs to be, I think the leaders of the curriculum need to sit down and say, okay, what do we want our children, what world do we want our children to live in? What do we want them to speak to when they leave these doors? And that is the place, I think that's the place that we start, because it can't just happen in English in such schools. It has to be across the school. The curriculum leaders need to be on board and have to be doing that thinking and that reading and that learning for this to take place. If it's not happening at the top, then it's not really going to work. I think an individual teacher would really crumble in the face of a parent saying, "You are what are you doing to my child?" So I think in terms of what I would do is I would start to kind of petition and start to speak to the leaders and start to have those conversations and say, okay, as a school, this is the world we live in. This is what we want our students to be, but this is what we're teaching them, and we are ignoring them. What can we do? And if you can galvanize the people in your department, the people across departments, and the school have a mission, and that changes, I think that is and that's big, but because of what I assume the pushback would be, I think it has to start in that place for it to be successful.
Thank you. Some other questions that we have is about parents and just really in regards to have you experienced any pushback from parents? Because I mean, there's a lot. We're seeing quite a lot in the media about varying different aspects of life issues, critical race theory, things like that, and how these things enter into our teaching, really. And so someone's just really keen to find out really what pushback you might have got from parents and how you've dealt with that, or your school has dealt with that.
Can I come in here just briefly?
Yeah.
We did have a bit of pushback when we started teaching Minty Alley, just because I don't know how many people are familiar with it, but it's a really interesting book because it's about so many things, but there is like an undercurrent of colorism, of racism in the book. So we did receive, I guess, questions from some parents about why we were getting rid of mice and men, etc. And I think I just come back to what I said earlier about making sure that your department has a shared goal for why you are teaching that text, because it might be that I've created that scheme of work, say I've made that decision to teach that text across the department. It might be that I'm not the one getting the pushback from the parent in the first instance. So making sure that every single teacher in the department knows why that text is being taught, why it's special. As Joyce said earlier, like, why are we teaching this right now? Why are we teaching this in this way to these students? And if you are a teacher and you're, I guess, on the other side of that and you're being told, okay, we're going to be teaching this text now, ask the question, why are we teaching this text? What's special about this book? because I want to be able to communicate that to students. So no matter what role you're in, you can ask those questions and you can make sure that in yourself you are confident on why that choice is being made.
Thank you. I'm going to roll these two questions into two, and I'm just conscious that we're getting towards our sort of time now. But here's sort of two questions. How can white teachers understand the issues for readers of colour with the text? But also, I thought I'd throw in this, what does calling in rather than calling out mean in practice? And what do you need to do this effectively in the moment? So you can answer either side of that, but I'd like to hear your thoughts.
I don't
What
mind
was the first half of the question?
So
Yeah,
the first
could you
half
repeat
of
the first
Yeah.
one?
yeah,
Sorry.
the first half of the
Apologies.
question is, how can white teachers understand the issues for readers of colour with the text? And then the second bit was about what does calling in rather than calling out mean in practice? And I think I have an answer to that one, but I'd really like to hear what you think on that.
I think that white teachers have to be aware and how can I say, accept that there are certain aspects of this experience that they'll never understand. But that is okay. It's okay that there are certain words that you cannot say, and there's certain aspects of my life that you won't understand. That doesn't mean that you cannot extend empathy, right? It doesn't mean because I have never experienced it, therefore, I just, it's off limits and it's very scary. It doesn't have to mean that. It means that I cannot speak to what it means to be a Muslim woman. I cannot speak to what it means to be in a wheelchair. There are certain aspects of life, and when that conversation is arising, I give space for other people to begin to speak. When people say the voice of the voiceless, you shouldn't be the voice for the voiceless, because the voiceless, they tend to have words. We just need to give them space to be able to use them. And so it's about acknowledging the privileges that you have, which I think is fundamental and something that I encourage. I've done in my own classroom, because I speak to my students. I say, I have class privilege. I do. And it means there's certain aspects of your experience that I haven't lived. And so I invite you to tell me what it means to live in this way. And I'm not the authority. I think it's about creating space and leading with empathy. Creating space, and then you lead with empathy. What do you think about this? Doing the reading, doing the work, and saying, who has experienced this? Or finding articles about people who have experienced it and being like, I can't imagine what it means to live in this person's shoes. What do you think? And we can build a really magical world in the classroom when we lead from a place of empathy, because some of our students haven't experienced it. But when we build empathetic students, we create adults who go into workplaces, and if their subordinates are not, the people they're line managing are not performing well, they lead with empathy. I think it's far reaching if we can teach people, even if I don't look like you, even if I don't experience what you experience, I still do my best to understand and show you grace. And I think that is what I would invite white teachers who are a bit cautious to do, as opposed to kind of being afraid. It's not. I don't want you to be fearful. I want you to be bold. I want you to be brave, and I want you to be empathetic, because that is more powerful than you having the words that you feel that you're missing. I hope that makes sense.
It really does. And just if anyone else wants to come in there very briefly.
Yeah, I will just really, really quickly. I think just Joy has already said it, but I think she's mentioned, like, doing the reading. And one book actually that I would really recommend for whoever has asked that question is I Heard What You Said by Jeffrey Bratchy. If you haven't read that, I think I recommend it to everyone here anyway. It's incredibly insightful, incredibly validating. So he is an educator. He's written a few YA books actually, which I've used in the classroom before. And he's Black male English teacher, that very, very rarest of, I think, we don't have many men actually in the English teaching, I think. And actually, being a Black male English teacher, in his experience, it's kind of part autobiography, a little bit about pedagogy, but it's so interesting. Essentially, the tagline is a Black teacher, a white system. It's really, really just a brilliant read, and that will really give you an insight into the I suppose from that aspect of being as a white teacher, how can you understand from that perspective? So I'd read that.
Look, thank you so much. We've come to an end. I just want to thank our panelists, Jessica, Joy, and Aisha, and to you all in the audience for this fantastic, really rich discussion. So we're now going to head to a short break. Please don't forget to scan the QR codes and secure your book bundles or something like that before we have the next session with Leslie Nelson Addy in conversation with Bernadine Evaristo about her award-winning novel, Girl, Woman, Other. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everybody. My name's Leslie Nelson Addy from Runnymede Trust, as I've been introduced already, and I just wanted to start off by introducing Bernadine Evaristo, who is an award-winning author of 10 books and numerous writings that span the genres of fiction, verse fiction, short fiction, non-fiction, poetry, essays, literary criticism, journalism, and radio and theatre drama. Her novel Girl, Woman, Other won the Booker Prize 2019 award, making her the first Black woman and Black British person to win it in its 50-year history. Girl, Woman, Other was added to the A-level curriculum in 2022, and that will be the kind of basis of our discussion today. So good morning, Bernadine Evaristo, so lovely to meet you.
Good to be here, Leslie, and good to be talking to all the people who are attending the conference.
Yes, absolutely. So just firstly, I'd like to thank you for writing such an incredible novel. There are characters in there that are for everyone, but also there were so many hilarious moments. I read it again in preparation for this and I just could not stop laughing. And I wanted to kind of first of all ask you about what inspired such humorous storytelling styles that you use for quite challenging topics, and what tips would you give to teachers who might want to teach students about writing humorous, creative pieces?
Okay, interesting question. You know, the humor comes naturally to me now. It's been there in practically all my books since my first book. My first book I think it had zero humor in it. And that was because it was a poetry collection based on poems that I'd written in my 20s, when I didn't think I'd really developed my sense of humor as a writer. And then a turning point for me was actually French and Saunders. People of a certain generation will remember French and Saunders most definitely. And British comedy still is very male, but it was extremely male in my childhood. And these were two women who were of my generation writing about women's issues. And they were really funny. And I remember they did a skit which was about schoolgirls. And I just remember thinking, oh, I want to write like that. I want to write with humor. And so I started to develop my ability to write humor. And it's got to the stage where, you know, Go Woman Other was my 8th book, where it just happens naturally. And if it's not there in the writing, I think there's something wrong with the writing. It's like the thing that really satisfies me as a writer is to feel that there is some humor there, because that stops it being po-faced and it makes it more complex and rounded. Because with all due respect, if a book is humorless, and some books are, and they can also be great books, I have to say, but I think it's harder to win the reader around. And I deal with, as you say, very serious subjects and topics and stuff, but there's always humor somewhere in it. And I feel that makes the book more, the reader more accepting of what I'm exploring. And there's also a balance of the seriousness and the humor, you know, the tragedy and the comedy. They kind of sit side by side in my work. But in terms of encouraging students to write humor, that's a really difficult one.
Yes.
I've asked that question before. They will know that some students, some kids, young people will have a very natural sense of humor. And some of them will be able to sort of transfer that to what they write. Yeah. I would say that the most important thing is to give the pupils freedom, you know, because if the way in which creative writing is taught in schools is prescriptive and the students feel that they have to abide by certain rules and have a certain kind of sensibility and aesthetic with what they're writing, then I think the humor is going to die. It's not going to come out. And we all actually have our own sense of humor, but you know, some people have developed it more than others. So I think it's giving the students freedom to write humor. And then the other thing, in a way, it's kind of like the most obvious thing, is to give them examples of humorous writing. Show them where writers have been funny in different ways. So like there is humor in my books, right? You can show an extract from that. There'll be humor in other books, which will be exploring humor in a different way. And so that then gives them a sense of what they might aim for. And I guess the final part of the answer is, it doesn't have to be funny. They don't have to be funny to be developing their writing skills.
Right.
It's a part of my practice. It doesn't have to be part of theirs. And they shouldn't feel the pressure to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And just another kind of question focused on this point around the comedy and the tragedy. How would you define the genre of girl, woman, other? I think there's often a moment where people apply genres to a text, but the author may not necessarily agree with that genre that's been given to that text. So I wanted to find out what your perspective is on the genre of girl, woman, other.
Well, in terms of literary genre, it's definitely literary fiction. I am 100% a literary writer in the sense that I am interested in language and how we use language. And I'm also interested in storytelling as well. But you don't have to be somebody with a particular sensitivity to language to tell great stories. And the books that actually do commercially, who perform best commercially in this country are what we might call commercial fiction. And those are books where often they're not particularly literary, but the writers can tell a very good story. I think an amazing book is, for example, one that a lot of people know is Misery by Stephen King. He does not finesse his sentences in a way that a literary writer might, but he can tell such an amazing story and has done for a very long time. So it's literary fiction, but within that, I call it fusion fiction. And that's something I made up. And because as I was writing it, I was thinking, this is really kind of like, it's not a traditional novel. It's breaking the rules, unconventional. It's kind of poetic, but it's not poetry. Yeah. And in terms of my oeuvre, I have written verse novels. I have written prose novels, although my language is always poetic, regardless of whether it's supposed to be a prose novel or not. And with this, I knew it was really experimental because it was like these looping stories, interconnected, the whole life of a character in 30 pages, and then other characters appearing in their stories and then moving on to the next and moving on to the next. And I thought, I've got to come up with an identity for this. And I thought, fusion fiction. So that's what I call it. I haven't heard of that used in this way for any other kind of fiction. So yeah. And it's also actually commercial because it became a commercial success.
Yes.
So even though we have these categories, the boundaries are always blurred.
Yeah. And can kind of evolve over time, as you've highlighted. Yes. Amazing. So the novel is a collection, as you said, of individual stories told in arguably a really short space of within the text about women from the African diaspora who are all connected in some way. I found that fascinating. In a few of these narratives, you explore the effort some of the characters make to maintain connection to their roots and their traditions. How does London as a city and a character in your novel help to hinder this effort?
Oh, I have to say, you've got great questions.
Thanks.
Great questions are ones where I have to think, because I have literally done hundreds of interviews, and usually they ask a question, I open my mouth, and I'm literally not thinking. I'm just saying what I've said before. You're making me think, which is great, right? London is my muse in many ways. It features strongly in most of my work, but I'm always trying to also take my characters out of London. So, if anybody's familiar with the whole of my work, they'll know that London is a recurrent kind of theme, but it's also, I try to be much more global because I don't want to be limited to London. And it's that the history of London is so deep. The demography of London is so interesting. It's so varied and is ever changing. The London of my childhood, very long time ago, is not the London we're living in today in many ways. The town I grew up in, Woolwich, was a white working class garrison town. It's less of a garrison town now. Now it is the next big kind of gentrified area, because the whole of the area around the Woolwich Arsenal, which was the old armaments factory, has been developed. There's a creative culture. It's changing. And I think that is really fertile for my imagination. At the same time, as a writer who's interested in writing about the African diaspora, I was very aware when I was writing Girl, Woman, Other, and I've been at other times, that it can't just be about London, the capital city, nor can it just be about other major UK cities, which is why I was pushing some of the characters into other parts of the country, like the north of England, and into rural society, because I feel that having, I'm very familiar with Black British literature, and I know for obvious reasons that a lot of the writers are London-based and do write about London for all the reasons I've mentioned, because it is where we settle, but it's also just such an interesting, fertile, ever-changing space. But at the same time, we need to claim ownership of these shores. And so it's really important that, for me, with Girl, Woman, Other, that I get the characters out of the city. And I still think it's quite London focused, but get them out of the city so that we can imagine a presence beyond the city. So I think the London issue is really interesting, because we don't want to be limited to it, because the UK is a huge country. And, in America, a lot of African-American writers did not grow up in, for example, New York. And so if you think about somebody like the great Toni Morrison, she grew up in Ohio. And I think all her novels were set in Ohio. And Alice Walker grew up, I think, in Georgia. So, and those are just two of the biggest names. So the spread is vast in America. But in the UK, we're still kind of in London, mainly. And even more specific, at the moment, South London.
Yeah.
Peckham, actually. Peckham is where a lot of writers are coming through, and they're writing about Peckham, which is wonderful. But we need to diversify in that way.
Absolutely. And in terms of diversifying, you also don't just kind of focus on space, but also some historical narratives too. So Ama's play is based on the kingdom of Dahomey. I hope I've pronounced that right. Details about this context are detailed in the first and final chapters of Girl, Woman, Other. When did you discover this history, and why did you choose to bookend the novel with this historical event?
Because essentially I'm a badass, right?
Yeah.
So the Amazons are African, from Dahomey. I say Dahomey. It's not right.
Okay.
I don't know how
Okay,
to
cool.
So they were these African warrior women from, a couple of hundred years ago. And I first heard about them probably about 40 years ago. And I was very interested in Black history. I was looking at African history at that time, not Black British history, because I wasn't really in tune with that. And there wasn't so much information about that, but definitely African history. And I was researching, and I was discovering all these African queens. And to be honest, that was so mind-blowing back then, because the sort of general knowledge about Africa and African history was so limited. It's still limited today, but it was even more limited 40 years ago. You didn't have access to a lot of information. It was long before the internet. And so I discovered these Amazon warriors, and I had this poster, which I may have somewhere. And it was a poster of Dahomean warrior women. And it was a photograph taken, I can't remember when it was taken, I guess by the time photography had been invented, maybe the late 1800s. And I had that on my wall, definitely just throughout the whole of my 20s. I had it framed. It was just incredible. So that was when I first heard about them. And they became kind of almost like spirit guides, because these women were warrior women who worked for the King of Dahomey, but they were fighters. And of course, anybody who's seen The Woman King will know Viola Davis and so many other incredible Black women actresses in that film at the moment. It is about the Amazon warriors, although she calls them by their original name, and I can't remember what that is. And so when I was writing this book, and Ama I was writing the character of Amma. She wasn't the first character I started with, by the way. It was Carol, but I put Amma in the beginning. I kind of switched it around. And it just made sense that this book was going to be about Black women, you know, who were fighters in all kinds of ways. And why not have her play being about Amazon women warriors? And then it made sense to finish it with it as well. So it kind of happened naturally. But the seeds of that began over 40 years ago.
40 years ago. Wow, that's amazing. That's so powerful. I was just thinking about this in terms of them being like, as you described them, as like spirits, or like influencing you through your own writing journey, which I just find really, really powerful. And it's haunting, but also inspirational at the same time. A few characters resolve their experiences of social isolation with assimilation. So you mentioned Carol, for example, who could be read in that way, that she kind of resolved some of the issues she experienced by becoming like more British, becoming more accepted within predominantly white spaces. What were you trying to communicate about the Western society and the social or even professional choices available to women of colour?
Yeah, another great question. A star.
Thanks.
People don't realise when I'm being interviewed, I'm actually interviewing them in a way. But, you know, the book is about plurality as much as I could get into a single novel. So there are 12 main characters, 11 of them are women, one is non-binary, and I just wanted to explore different areas in a way that there could be some connection between them. And Carol is a character that a lot of people really notice and often relate to. It's really, really interesting. I would say the one character people talk about more than any other is Carol. And I think that is because of what you're talking about what it's like to grow up in a society where you are seen as being at the bottom of the heap, and you're subject to all kinds of discrimination, race and gender and class, and also where you live, which is kind of tied in with class, but doesn't always have to be.
Yeah.
And then you find yourself moving with the elite in that society, the people who actually control that society. And that was a hell of a journey that Carol had to go on. And we are minoritized as people of color in this society. So that's one of the realities that we have to deal with. But with that, along with that, it is also a majority white society. So we have to make decisions about how we navigate that, how we negotiate climbing our way through this society to achieve the things that we want to achieve. And for Carol, she chose to assimilate in the way that she lost herself, or she lost who she had been. She lost her culture. She rejected her culture. She kind of was on the verge of rejecting her mother. Yeah. She had to completely change how she looked, how she spoke, how she thought, how she behaved when she was at Oxford. And that doesn't just happen to people of colour.
No.
Who come from working class backgrounds. That happens to lots of people who go to Oxford and Cambridge. You know, within a week, they're talking differently. But in her case, that was the way in which she could get on. The only way she could be there, because otherwise she was going to feel like she felt she was going to feel isolated for the rest of her time there. And then that continues through her life, and it works for her. It actually works for her. So I was showing that this is actually a success for her, and she's not somebody who code switch is. And that was also an option open to her, except perhaps not, because there was nobody around to show Carol that she could code switch. Yeah. You know, because we have to get that from somewhere. And so for her, there were two choices. Either she leaves the university and disappoints herself, disappoints her mother and the rest of it, but still stays the same as the person she is growing up, or she becomes a success in this society.
Yeah.
And that was the choice she made.
I think I understand why a number of people speak to you about Carol, because I feel like there's a lot of personal resonance as well. In some way, shape or form, we're confronted with the choice to either assimilate or, like you say, code switch, or actually completely refuse to engage in that way, and the consequences are there. But it's powerful that you speak about assimilation being a route in her story as being one of success, because I think oftentimes when assimilation is spoken about, it's given such negative connotations, in a sense of almost denying yourself in order to survive, and it shouldn't be that way. But perhaps the time, the space will all determine whether it is actually a success or not.
But it's also that, we do change as individuals. It's going to happen anyway, whether we're assimilating or not. Most people are going to change through the course of their lives. So you may grow up listening to reggae, but you may have an affinity for classical Western music. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you're assimilating. It's just that your tastes have changed,
Yeah.
It is very complicated, but it was really important for me to explore that, what it takes to be a successful professional.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you expose inequalities in the education system and in the theatre industry. You also seem to present like a generational disparity between the older and younger characters' attitudes and efforts to social reform and political resistance. So do any of these ideas link to your own experiences over the years? Like, it'd be nice to get to know a bit more about you in this regard.
That's a really nice way of phrasing it, because people still today say to me, are all the characters versions of you? Yeah, it's crazy. I was abroad quite recently, like 3 months ago. I'm just like, I'm still hearing this 4 years later. It's crazy. But I think I grew up in the 60s and 70s. I was definitely, I think everybody knows now, I was very feminist, political activist, very Black feminist, pro-Black, and wanting to change society, which my first vehicle was theatre of Black women. And of course, Amma is also somebody who's growing up in the same period I grew up in. And Amma isn't me, but out of all the characters, there's a little bit of me in Amma, and my earlier life was a bit like hers. And that was really important to write the narrative of feisty young women of color who felt rejected by white mainstream society in the 70s and 80s, and were determined to create art for themselves and to be at the helm of their creativity, to self-define and to find their community and to speak from and to their community. And that is Amma. But at the same time, because I've been around a long time, and I mix with all kinds of people, and I have lots of young people in my life, some of them are friends, I'm very aware of the changes that have happened. And I think it's really important that as we age, we stay in touch with what young people are doing, instead of adopting this slightly superior approach or this slightly superior attitude of thinking that the young are wrong because their attitudes are different. So the relationship between Yaz and Amma, which is quite different, was something that was really interesting to explore, as well as Morgan as well. The current wave of women who are feminists, or they may not identify as feminists, they may actually no longer identify as female, and the differences between those generations, and just kind of exploring it and airing it, and kind of presenting different arguments, which I do at the end of the book, between Dominique and Amma, and kind of Morgan's always there in the background, and Yaz, and so that's all part of it. I don't think really that I could have written the age range that I wrote if I was somebody who only mixed with my own age group.
Right.
This is something that I've been thinking about a lot recently, that as you get older, you have your friendship group. And a lot of people don't leave that friendship group. And as a writer, how do you stay in touch with young people today if you're not communicating with them on an equal level? And that was really important. That is really important for me to continue to do.
Yeah.
And also, young people aren't moaning about their aches and pains and memory loss. Seriously, it's quite fun being around young people.
Yeah, and it's great that you mentioned young people, because kind of going off of that, like your presentation of Yaz, who for me, I know that there are a number of young characters in the book, but I feel like she really exemplifies the younger generation for me anyway. And I just wanted to kind of find out about what your hopes were in terms of the younger generations, what they would receive from this text, considering how you positioned Yaz in this text. Yeah, so what were your hopes that students would
So
learn?
Yaz is 19 at the start of the book, so she is the youngest. And I love the fact that young women come to my readings, and men too, but primarily my audience is female, and they tend to dominate at literary festivals anyway. And I know that a lot of guys don't read books by women. That's statistically true. Yeah. But I love the fact that I have young women in my audience, and also I get feedback from young women about Yaz, and saying what you said about, you know, how they find her relatable in some ways, and also about just opening their mind to the scale of Black British womanhood, because, you know, there is Hattie at the age of 33 who's a farmer, and you've got Shirley who's a school teacher, and what I want to do is to get inside all these characters, and I think through doing that I am dissolving some of the barriers that we have to understanding different age groups, different demographics, different points of view. And if I had Girl, Woman, Other available to me when I was like 19, I would have, I mean, this is not, I'm not saying this egotistically at all, but I would have been mind blown, because it would have been British. The only books that were available, pretty much nearly the only books that were available for Black British people in the late 70s were African-American books. And by the 80s, it was African-American women writers like Toni Morrison, Alice Walker, who I loved, but they weren't writing about Britain. And also they didn't necessarily have that scale of representation of different kinds of womanhood, including a non-binary figure. So it would have really opened my eyes, not only to perhaps holding up a mirror to myself in some ways, but also to the women around me, and also the women who weren't around me. So I hope they find it. I hope young people find this book as enlightening as maybe anybody else does, even though I'm not there to educate. You know, as a writer, I'm there to tell stories. I'm not there to educate, but people do feedback to me that it opened their eyes. And I hope young women find that to be a kind of a consequence of reading it, and also that they do see themselves in some ways in it.
Yeah, represented in those characters. And you speak about friendship. You spoke about friendship earlier, which I thought was really, really powerful in terms of thinking about cross-generational friendships. But I wanted to speak a little bit more about the complexity of motherhood, and what is the importance, it's with specific consideration of some of the relationships that you present in the novel, of mothers in this Black community. Like, what is the importance of mothers there?
You know, the mother theme is one that I didn't really realize I was exploring till the end of the book.
Right.
And then I was like, oh, hang on. There are 4 mother-daughter relationships out of the main characters, and many more kind of sort of less sort of subsidiary character figures are also mother-daughter relationships. And then I kind of realized that it just made sense. It just made sense that if you're going to have an intergenerational book, which was the plan, that and I wrote it in such a way that I would write one character and then their mother would come into it, or I would write a mother and their child would come into it. So I started writing Amma. Yaz was not part of the plan. And then at some point, writing Amma's story, I'm like, oh, I know she's going to have a kid. Yeah, that's great. And she's going to have a kid with Roland. Even better. you know. And so Yaz came into it, and then Carol's section, it was like her mother came into it. And as a writer, I am actually very big on family as a writer, and it's something that critics and people who write about my work don't pick up on, because they're always thinking, it's about race, it's about gender, it's about sexuality, it's about class. I'm like, yeah, and it's about family, and it's about relationships. You could write a book about Go and Another, all about family.
Yes.
And you could write another book all about other kinds of relationships and friendships, seriously, let alone a little essay, because that is, we don't exist in isolation. We exist in a network of relationships, and especially when we're younger, our primary relationships are with our families. And so that's how it materialized. It was just a very organic process. And then what I like is that they're different kinds of relationships as well.
Yes.
You know, maybe there are some kind of recurrent themes, but they're different. You know, Yaz and Amma are different to Carol and Bumi, and Shirley and Winsome again have a different kind of relationship.
Yeah, amazing. And I was actually, it occurred to me, I'm like, okay, I don't want to ask all the questions about women, because there are male characters in your book. And as you say, although the audience may not be populated with many men, some men do engage. And so I just wanted to I'm intrigued about the husbands and fathers and the way that they're presented as well. Often literature written by Black authors presenting the kind of Black family relationship often present Trey and Jordan's type of characters and that kind of stereotypical experience there. But in your text, you've kind of explored such an expanse, like you say, that plurality, that diversity. And I really wanted you to speak to some of the male characters that you included in the text, and kind of what inspired the direction that you took to convey that sense of plurality. And even then, some of the characters are really complex in that they're really good husbands, but they may also be adulterous, etc. So I just kind of wanted you to speak to those choices you made there.
You know, I kind of feel that often I don't need what we call a sensitivity reader, because I'm really sensitive to the issues myself. I kind of, because I'm so aware as I'm writing, and it's not even that I'm overthinking it, it's just there. I'm aware that if I'm gonna have all these characters, I just don't want anyone to feel that I've written stereotypes. And so, but at the same time, there are certain realities that stereotypes might sometimes be based on. So I just wanted that span. And Roland gave me a lot of pleasure. And in the original draft, Roland had his own section, because I found Roland very, very funny and entertaining. And then eventually my editor said, look, Roland kind of throws it out a bit, because it is about 11 women, one non-binary character. You know, you've now got Roland. It kind of changes the dynamic somehow. And so my heart bled, and I had to reduce Roland's contribution as much as entertaining as I found him. So he is a gay man, a successful academic, but he's also quite narcissistic, and very, very opinionated, and a great sort of counterpoint to Amma, and also great material for Yaz, who as a teenager sees faults with both her parents. I love writing that, because we know that, you know, teenagers often get to a stage where they're really critical of their parents, and there's a lot to be critical of from Yaz's point of view. And she hasn't yet reached the stage where she might be more compassionate and understanding and really understand where her parents are coming from. So he is a successful public figure, and that was important. And also, I knew it'd be unexpected, because there aren't that many Rolands out there in this country, to be honest, not who are as well known as he is, you know, on television a lot and so on. Lennox is kind of like just your regular guy, you know, but also has his backstory. He's succeeded, he's struggled.
Yeah.
He's this solid figure. And I did worry a bit about making him an adulterer. But I was like, it's such a good story. You know, you got to complicate everybody, right?
Yeah.
Everybody has to, every single protagonist, and there are 12 of them, have to be complicated. And in a way, you feel you know Roland. You may even recognize Roland. But then what he does is something that completely throws everything out of whack. It's like, what? And yet it's also something that stays secret ever.
Yeah.
It's between him and the mother. So, you know, I feel that this book, there are so many touch points in this book that might cause people to reflect on people they know, situations they know, plus themselves. You know, so the kind of secret affair, let alone between your mother-in-law, was very kind of juicy to write.
Yeah.
And then Augustine, you know, Carol's father, who is a minor figure, but a very positive figure. You know, some people have said to me, you know, well, I think you're a bit critical of the guys. And I'm like, that wasn't my intention. And I think if I'm critical with the guys, I feel I'm critical with everybody, because everybody, you see everybody through kind of 360 degrees. You know,
Yeah.
you see them through how they see themselves, how other characters see them, and so on. And then it's up to you if you want to judge the characters.
Yeah.
But Augustine doesn't really put a foot wrong, except he dies. So then he becomes an absence, you know. Yeah.
And it's interesting actually you make the point about Augustine, because I think that despite him dying, Bumi definitely uses him as like a source of a lot of her decisions and like perspectives and the way that she even communicates with Carol. So I feel like he still in some way lives on through her in that way, and obviously that I think is evidence therefore of him being a loving father and husband too.
That's right. And then there's Joseph. I'm just remembering.
Yeah.
It is Joseph, isn't it? It's been a few years.
Yeah.
Grace's father,
yeah,
you know, who was also a good man, but he's a man of his time. He is. He's a man of his time. And, you know, this is like 100 years before Oprah, right? Or not 100 years, but, you know, all the conversations that we've had about how you know, about women and you know, sexual relationship within marriage, all the rest of it, that we have to remember we're talking about a relationship that was 120 years ago. You know, so people may think that he's a brute, but is he within the context of the society he's growing up in? It's not for me to judge. Other people do, but I write what I think is the truth of the situation.
That time, that context. Amazing. I can't believe the time has literally flown. It's upon us completely. And I just want to say thank you so much to the delegates for sending in questions. I'm going to get to the delegates' questions first, and then if we have time, I'll go to the final ones. But a teacher's asked you to speak about Shelley, the character who is Shirley, the character who's the teacher in the book. So they just wanted to know a little bit more about
Shirley. I like Shirley. I like all my characters. I love them all. They're all my children. But Shirley, you know, I had a lot of fun writing Shirley because she's somebody who's also successful. She's a school teacher. My mother was a school teacher. And my mother retired a long time ago now. She's 89. She retired 30 something years ago. But I did some research into what it was like for her teaching in the 1980s, because she left at the end of, my maths isn't good, but anyway, she stopped teaching at the end of the 1980s or early 90s. And I know because she had talked about it, you know, it became very difficult. So I used that research, how the education system changed during her time of teaching, and it became much more impositional and difficult, and schools became more difficult in all kinds of ways, you know, social issues and so on. And then I put that into Shirley's story about somebody who goes into teaching as as somebody who is committed to furthering, bringing on the next generation of children who are growing up in a, what would have been called a deprived area, passing on her knowledge, she feels love, such beneficence and love for the children, and how she gets worn down over 40 years, but also doesn't really help herself. So she's because she could have moved to a different school, and we know why, because she can't take that risk. She's somebody who's really unable to change her life. She finds herself stuck. Shirley is stuck. And for a character like Shirley, I've been around. I'm Shirley's age, I've known people like that, who have become stuck in whatever it is they're doing, and then also can't appreciate what they have. So another reason Shirley was interesting is because, as her mother says, you got a nice car, you got a big house, you paid off your mortgage, you got a cushy job, you have really long holidays, you got a hunky husband, you got 2 lovely grandchildren, all these external markers of a successful, happy life. And Shirley isn't happy. And her mother can't understand that. And the deeper psychology, you can also look at that in terms of her relationship with Lennox, Winsome's relationship with Lennox. What is going on? What is the deeper psychology going on there? Why does Winsome go for Lennox, really? Because she sees her daughter having all these things that she doesn't have. And at the end of her life, later in her life, when she retires to Barbados, she has a lovely life. She has spent something like 40 years struggling, right? And her daughter has, in her opinion, everything and can't appreciate it. And has very real concerns about what it's like teaching now and what it's like teaching in her school. Obviously, it's the criminal element and the violence and so on and so forth. And they're very, very real. But she doesn't change her situation. I feel like I'm talking to the teachers here now.
Yeah, no, literally.
There might be some people thinking, that's it, I'm going to resign. I'm going to get a job.
Relocate to Barbados. But anyway, how do you feel about being studied in the classroom and students writing exam essays on your work?
I love it, actually, because it means, it means my work is being taken seriously. What makes me laugh is sometimes students and school pupils write to me and basically ask me the kind of questions that will mean that I'm writing their essay for them.
Right.
That is really funny. By the way, teachers, I feel your pain with ChatGPT and the AI and all the stuff that's going on now, because it's such an issue. But I feel that they it's a recognition that my work is being taken seriously. So when Go Woman Other went onto the curriculum, I was absolutely delighted, because I've always wanted that. And really, it kind of took the booker for that to happen. But now it's happened. I think it's great. And I love the fact that young people are reading and engaging with my work.
Yeah, absolutely. And just on that point, if students are to select your novel as a text for their coursework, what text do you think they can study alongside it to kind of illuminate the themes and the ideas that you spoke about in Go Woman Other?
Oh, so what other books you mean?
Yeah, so like 1 or 2, maybe one canonical text and then one modern text that you can think of that they might be able to make an interesting.
Well, I have big issues with The Lonely Londoners by Samuel Selvon, because it's seen as the defining work of the Windrush generation. Published like, how many years? 50, 70 years ago. But it is not quite 70, maybe 6 years ago, but it is about young men, and the women are invisible in it. And when they're talked about, it's in a derogatory way. And so I think it's a very problematic text. I'm not saying it shouldn't be taught, but I think it should be taught in context. So from that to Go Woman Other, a comparative analysis of that would be really, really interesting. And a more contemporary book, I'm really pleased to say, for anybody who's looking for books by Black British women novelists to teach or to refer to or to read, I wrote an essay for Vogue a few months ago, British Vogue, and it's still online. You can access it. And I mentioned 60 books that are being published this year. including books by Diana Evans, for example, who has now written several novels. So I think there's a lot of material to draw on. But if it's and so let's talk about a non-fiction book, then I think, British by Afua Hirsch, I think is a good text to read to give people a bit of a context. David Olusoga, Black and British, the history of Black Britain. I mean, there were many predecessors to that book, but that's really, it's a current one, and it's really good.
Yeah, absolutely. And for the character of Carol, what, in terms of what you said about being a professional in a white majority country, how did you research and write Carol's character? So one of the teachers have asked, how did you research and write Carol's character?
So some of the characters were easier to write than others. Carol was very easy. She was very easy. She just came to me. And as I kind of say, I've said it a few times, I've lived a long time and I've been around a lot of Black women, right? And families and the rest of it. So, and I grew up in one as well. I had a white mum, so that was different. But I kind of, it's there. Everything I've ever experienced, seen, read, witnessed, known, went into the making of Carol. The research I needed to do was into her job, because I don't understand finance, and it was a pain trying to explain her job without keeping the story lively.
Yes.
So that was the research. So yeah, so it was like, if you're around people, sometimes you don't need to research because you know it.
Yeah.
You know what needs to be written.
That reminds me, actually, I wanted to ask, was Bumi also a mathematician? Were you trying to...
She did, I think she did economics.
Yeah, because the way you presented her was that she was just as good at maths as...
No, I think she did maths.
I was going to say, yeah, okay, cool. Okay, good.
Because like I say, I'm very sensitive to stereotypes. So what would be the opposite to a stereotype for Bumi? It would be maths.
Yeah.
People are like, oh, maths, well, why not?
Why not? Absolutely. And do you believe... if your role isn't to educate as a writer, one of the teachers wants to know, like, what is your role? What do you feel it is? Is it to entertain? What is it?
All of those things. So, I think if you see yourself as an educator when you are writing fiction, obviously, if you are writing a book about history, you are educating people. Yeah. But if you see yourself as an educator when you're writing fiction, I think the fiction is going to suffer. It is going to be didactic. It is not coming from an open creative space, because the idea with fiction is that you create characters, stories, scenarios, and you make them as rich, as exciting, as interesting, as exploratory as you can, and then it lands where it lands. The reader needs to feel that they can connect to it in whatever way they do, as opposed to being told, this is the way you need to read this.
Yes.
And it feels like if you're coming from an educator viewpoint, educator creative approach, that you are then telling people how to read it.
Yeah.
And also the role of fiction isn't necessarily to educate. It is to entertain. It is a way in which we see ourselves reflected or not. It is a way in which we just explore the society around us, that we create drama and suspense and, work with the imagination. All of those things are to do with writing fiction. And it's, my point of view is you need to keep it as open as possible.
Absolutely. And let the reader take that agency and engage with it as they choose. Absolutely. Someone's asked about the additional text. So you spoke about Afua Hirsch's British, but in terms of these additional texts, this isn't in relation necessarily to understanding Girl, Woman, Other, but more in terms of critical thinking around diversity and race within the school. So I just wanted to know if there were any other texts that were related to that you could get insight on.
I don't know if I'm the best person to ask this. I think Lit in Colour
Yeah.
will most definitely have a list of those books, and some of them will be published by Penguin, which will help people think about the critical thinking. And, you know, I guess Renée Edo-Lodge, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. It's a good place to have a sort of 101 into some of those intersectional issues.
Yeah, thanks for the plug. And before we kind of round up and like wrap up, I wanted to speak because I'm so fascinated by the fact that one of your stories was going to be Roland's experience. That is incredible to have heard that from you today. If you were to release a deluxe version of the novel, so, you know, some albums have like a deluxe version where they add a few songs with more characters. Is there a woman featured in the novel whose story you'd want to give space as you did these other characters?
Wow, that's amazing. You know something? The first character that comes to mind is Nzinga. Yeah. Let's hear what Nzinga's got to say, right?
Yeah.
She gets a bit of a rough deal.
Yeah.
You know, that would be so interesting.
Yeah.
That's a great question again.
Yeah.
Nobody's asked me that. But yeah.
Me too.
Nzinga.
I'd love to hear
in her own words.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So a comment came in about from the audience kind of referencing how important it is for literature to push beyond cities and address experiences of people of colour in rural areas, as you explored in the text and said earlier on. And the teacher just wanted to know, like, how did you find writing those parts of the book in terms of setting the kind of the scene of those spaces, but then also trying to explain how being Black in those spaces actually felt. So I guess we're thinking about
so a lot of research, to be honest. I would say the northern part of the book, which is Hattie, Grace and Morgan, was the hardest in terms of describing place and just understanding the society and culture, especially as it was also historical and rural, right? About which I know nothing. So, you know, what was it like to be living and working on a farm 100 years ago, you know, and then the changing life on a farm through the 20th century. And then also, and also where Grace is growing up, which is, I think, South Shields, you know, so I had to do a lot of research. A lot of it is now available on the internet. Years ago, it wasn't, so it makes it a lot easier. And then Clovis and Winsome going to Cornwall.
Yes.
And me writing that and looking at the map and trying to work out what their route would have been and what it would have been like for them there. So a lot of research. And then eventually you get enough for it to feel authentic, because you want people to feel like you know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And in fact, not even to think that you know what you're talking about, but just to feel that they're in that place.
They're there.
Like, yep, this is now, I'm in this rural space, da, 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 da. And I was going to go and visit somewhere like Northumberland and go and visit a farm, but I just never got round to it. So I just had to do it through my imagination, which is really hard.
Yeah, but I think this point that you're making about the role that reading plays in writing is really powerful as well for teachers who might be supporting young people who want to become writers themselves, that actually reading, doing research, maybe not being able to access those spaces physically, but having insight in that way. Both fictional and non-fiction text can also.
I think, a couple of things. One is that I think it's really important that I don't know how people teach English literature today, but I think it's really important to allow the children to have their own contribution, whether you agree with it or not.
Yes.
But they kind of need to defend it. And the second thing, in terms of if you're setting them creative writing exercises, is to, even though you're grading their work and so on, is to try and suspend judgment as much as possible, because that can kill creativity. And also to let them know that where they begin is not where they're going to end up, that people grow into their talent. So, you know, some of the children will have more of a natural facility with writing than others. That doesn't mean to say that those who don't have that, natural facility, which is probably coming about through their background anyway, like how much their parents are reading to them, whether they get encouragement at home and so on, that they cannot develop those skills as they grow through the system. Because I teach creative writing at university. I've been teaching creative writing for a long time. It's what I tell my students, because often they think if they can't do it now, they'll never be able to do it.
Yeah.
Creative writing, because creative writing is something special. And they need to know that they can grow into their talent.
Yeah, absolutely. And I honestly believe that is a perfect way to end this discussion. Thank you so much for your insightful comments and just being a great laugh. Actually, I've really enjoyed speaking to you today.
Thank you for a lovely interview.
Thank you. And thank you to all the delegates as well for sending in your questions and for your engagement. Just don't forget to take a picture of the QR code so you can access the book bundles. There's going to be a short 10-minute break after this. And then following the break, we will have Tanika Gupta being interviewed by Matthew Courtney. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Oh, hi everyone. So I'm Dale. I'm an English teacher and whole school reading and literacy lead at a secondary school in Coventry, and I am I've got the honour and joy of speaking to Tanika Gupta here today. So Tanika, over the past 25 years, has written over 25 stage plays that have been produced in major theatres across the UK. She's a fellow of Rose Bruford College, runs courses for the Arvin Foundation, has led many playwriting workshops in UK universities, as well as for the National Theatre, Royal Court Hampstead, Young Vic, and Theatre Royal Stratford East. She's presently a visiting lecturer at the Royal Holloway University of London and Royal Central School of Speech and Drama. In 2019, her play The Empress was added to the GCSE English Literature curriculum by Pearson of Excel and is currently being performed by the RSC. I'm going to be speaking to Tanika. We'll have at the end a chance for some questions from you guys. If you want to be putting questions in the chat, I'll hopefully get to answer as many of those. Ask as many of those. I won't be answering them. Tanika will be as we can. Before I ask my first question to Tanika, just for those of you who don't know about the play, The Empress is a play that is about Asian characters, about living in England, in London, in the 19th century during the last 14 years of Queen Victoria's reign, and about their experiences living in Britain during that time. So first of all, I've been very rude and haven't actually said hello to Tanika yet. So hi, Tanika.
Hello, how are you?
I'm very good, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, not bad, thanks.
Good. So my first question is, what and who inspired your creation of the play?
So when I was at university, a tutor was a very bad student, but a tutor did give me a book to read. And of course, I didn't read it because I was only about 19. And then 10 years later, I read it and I thought, wow. And it was a book by Rosina Vishram. And I think she'd written it in 1986. And it was called Ayahs, Lascars and Princes. And in it had a photograph of a group of Indian women from the Indian subcontinent sitting around a table in 1891 reading the Bible. And it said, Ayah's Home, 1891 Jury Street. And I thought, who on earth are these women? They look like sort of Asian Mary Poppins. They were all dressed in black and looked quite very sweet but demure. And it turned out, when I read more about it in the book, that these were ayahs who are basically nannies who looked after English colonial children, who were brought over by boat by the English to look after their kids from India. And then basically when they got to Tilbury Docks, quite often they were dumped and told, we don't need you anymore. So there were literally hundreds of destitute ayahs wandering around the streets of 19th century Britain. And it was only when the group of evangelical women opened this refuge, basically, for these ayahs, that they were able to live, have a roof over their heads. And I thought, wow, that would make a great story and a great play. And that's really where it came from. So that's the original. It's a photograph in a book that I read, basically. Is the long answer.
That's yeah, it's wonderful. It does make a fantastic story, and one that my students certainly have really, really engaged really well with. They've loved it, and I've loved teaching it. So you structured the play into 2 acts with 15 scenes each. What made you decide to make that decision in terms of the structure of the play?
Yeah, I think it's called Absolute Chaos, because as I researched the play, I kept finding more and more characters that I wanted to put in the play. So many people have complained that the script reads more like a film script than a stage script, because there are so many scenes and the locations shift, and there are so many characters. And so really, in terms of why did I structure it that way, it's I have no idea, to be honest, apart from the fact that I wanted to tell all these stories. So it wasn't just the ayahs, it was the Lascars, who were the sailors, it was also the politicians, it was also Queen Victoria and her relationship with Abdul Karim. And it's interesting that it's talked about as a play about Asian characters, but because actually there are quite a lot of English characters in there as well. So it's quite diverse in its casting, and it's also because I didn't want to just do an Asian play. I wanted to show that actually there were quite a lot of sympathetic English people in the play, including Lusker Sally, who is actually based on a real live character who did exist. There was also apparently a Calcutta Louise, but I quite like Lusker Sally's name better. So it's about friendships as well as animosities and, you know, the usual racism. But for me, the structure was very much about making sure that each story had a journey. And I guess that the second half is much more about the politician, Dadabai Naoroji, who's the first Indian MP. So it becomes more political as the play goes on, and hopefully kind of, you know, climaxes with, you know, the fact that he goes back to India to fight the good fight.
Yeah. Interesting that you said about the about having you know, quite a lot of white characters in there as well who are quite sympathetic. One of the things I found with teaching actually is that quite a lot of my students, to begin with, assume that Laskar Sally must have been Asian because if she was sympathetic and you know, and spent time with the Lascars, she must have been Asian. No white person would do that. And actually, sort of like, you know, I think it's quite interesting, sort of presenting that idea of you know, that sympatheticness, and actually the fact that in many cases a lot of the lower class white characters have more in common with the Asian characters than they do with the upper class white characters in the play, I think, which I find really interesting. I think a lot of my pupils did as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, I would call it, I would say that it's about working classes, isn't it? Because actually those domestic servants like, you know, Rani and the sailor, Lusker, have got a lot more in common with people like Lusker Sally and even Georgina, or Georgie, who have to work for a living. They can't just sit around ordering other people. And so yes, you're right. Absolutely, they have more in common. And so, in a way, if you look forward to many years, it's about class and not about race. And those friendships do last. I mean, I was very keen to show the friendship between, for example, Feroza, the older Ayah, and Lusker Sally, that goes back a long way. That they obviously know each other for the last 20 years, and actually there's a genuine friendship there. And it continues with Rani. And I was very keen to show that, because personally I don't live in an only Asian world, and I also have many friends and family from all walks of life, and I really wanted to kind of try and show that through the play, really, that it doesn't have to all be so polarized.
No, absolutely, yeah. So the play is set across, as I said earlier, across the last 14 years of Queen Victoria's reign. Why did you choose that particular period?
Well, it neatly sort of coincided with my slight obsession with that period of history, in that it was the beginnings of Indian nationalism in India. So it's when the British Raj, it's when Queen Victoria basically becomes Empress of India, that the British Raj really kicks off in India. And so in terms of the way that they're treated, the famines, all the rest of it, I was very interested in the fact that there were so many Indians running around in London in 19th, not just London, actually all over the country, but certainly in London at the end of the 19th century. So it's not just the Ayers and the Luskers. There are also all these politicians. There are students of law. And then of course there's Abdul Karim, who serves Queen Victoria in the last 14 years of her reign, which is sort of like neatly coincides with the fact that she dies in 1901. And also I think because I was commissioned by the Royal Shakespeare Company, I was sort of thinking about the play by Shakespeare, The Tempest, where they all turn up on an island, a sort of unforgiving island, and meet all these strange characters. And obviously it's nothing like The Tempest, I'm not saying that, but that was a kind of weird template in my head. It's always quite good to write with an idea of where you know why you're writing it, and so that's why the play begins on the boat and ends on the boat as well, so that they do leave the island, because it is an island at the end of the day, Britain, and so and it's a very small island as well, and yet it ruled so much of the world. So it's sort of yeah, that's the kind of template. I've wandered off from your question. Sorry, Dale.
That's all right. Interesting. You said Dadabai says some point in the play about why should such a small island control so much of the world. And you know, that's very much true. Actually, talking about Dadabai, again, I think that a lot of the people that I taught were really surprised to find out that we had an Asian MP in the 19th century. You know, that's not something that they knew about, and would have been taught in history. And again, I think a lot of them found that really interesting, and found this figure that a lot of them didn't know about, had never heard of before, and found him a really fascinating figure, because he really was, and he was one of the great heroes of Indian independence. So yeah. I have to say I got slightly obsessed with him. Because I like you say, we've never heard. I actually worked as a community worker for many years in Finsbury and Islington, and I remember coming across a little blue plaque with his name on it, saying that he was the MP for that area, elected in 1891. Or was it 2? I can't remember. Anyway, it was just, and I remember thinking, who is this guy? I've never heard of him, and yet he was so influential on people like Gandhi and everybody else that came after him. Yeah, absolutely. So why did you choose then to set most of the play in England? Well, all the bits in England, apart from the bits that are on the ship. What are the key messages about empire that you intended your play to address and convey?
Well, again, slightly skewed in that I was also thinking about my own parents who came to Britain in the 60s, in the very early 60s, and the kind of reception they got when they got here. And they were very much like, they were educated people from India. They were university graduates. They were coming to what they thought was the land of Shelley, Keats and Byron. And they believed in British fair play and justice. And actually, I think they really, really, it's a very common story, but they really struggled with racism and ignorance and all the rest of it. And so, in a sense, the play is a bit about my parents' journey, even though it's set 100 years earlier, or not quite 100, 80 years earlier. I think that I didn't want to set it in India, because I didn't want it to be about India. I wanted it to be about British experience, British history. And when people talk about it being like it's an Asian play, you kind of go, no, actually it's part of all of our history, all of us, and many people intermarried as well, and continue to. So it's not a separate world. It's actually about all of us. So it's not about bashing anyone or anything like that, but it's about looking at interesting stories from that period.
It's interesting you talk about your parents believing that sense of of British fair play, because one thing I found quite starking is that Dadabai really believes in the sense of British fair play, and he really sort of has a lot of faith in that until quite late on into the play. And I find that quite interesting that maybe that was also partly because it's a reflection of what your parents believed and what they felt coming to Britain.
Yeah, no, totally. They were completely shocked at the way that they were treated. They couldn't believe it. For example, this sort of common story about trying to find a house to live in and seeing a notice up on the door saying no Irish, no dogs, no coloured, or whichever way it was around. And a lot of people are saying, oh no, those notices never existed. That's rubbish. There's no record of it. And yet my parents said again and again, oh my God, they did exist, and we couldn't get housing. We literally went round so many different houses. And I think that's, without going on too much about what contemporary history, it is still the fact that there were many, many people of colour living in Britain at that time. So I'm only concentrating on the Indians. And when I say Indian, I mean the Indian subcontinent, because at that time, Pakistan, Bangladesh, etc., they were all one country. And And interestingly, most of the Luscars were actually Muslim. But the whole breadth of the sort of immigration of different people coming over to Britain was massive, because it was the head of the empire. So you had freed African people who had settled in Britain from the 1820s. You had people from all over the world who came to work in Britain. So I think that the stories that we often see is not a good reflection. It's not the right reflection of what Britain was like. In terms of diversity. And if you were just to read a Dickens novel, you'd think that everybody was white in London, but actually that's not the case. And there are little hints here and there. I mean, for example, if you read Wuthering Heights, the identity of Heathcliff is really, really ambiguous. And I think that's really clever, because he's talked about as a Luscar, he's talked about as a son of a Chinese emperor, and he's even talked about as an African, and he's called a tinker, which is a rather derogatory term for an Irish person. So, but Bronte never actually kind of like nails it down, and so Heathcliff's identity is quite interesting. I think there's another play there as well, actually. Who was Heathcliff?
I look forward to seeing it. Sort of linking on to that, there are some texts that that feature Black and Asian people, but often as quite docile, even when they're being mistreated. You chose to present Rani's anger and frustration in the play. I think one of the most sort of scenes that stands out the most for that is obviously when Lord Oakham is casting her out when she becomes pregnant with his child.
Yeah.
And that really stood out as a scene for me, both reading it and when I went to see it at the RSC last month. Why did you choose to present Rani's anger and frustration so sort of strongly and so clearly?
Well, I think it's about characterization. I think it's very boring if they just allow everything to wash over them and characters and not fight back. And ultimately, the Empress is Rani. That she is the center of our story. Even though Queen Victoria is the Empress of India, Rani also means queen in Bengali. So she to me is my real empress. And so I needed to have I don't like to use the word feisty. I've been told off for using that word, but certainly a sort of spirited and strong woman character is very important, because otherwise they just end up being things happening to them rather than them actually making things happen. And I think that's really important, that you can change your life.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I think again,
and stand up to bullies, basically.
Yeah, Rani's growth though, as she becomes more and more sort of confident in sort of expressing herself and expressing her views and wanting to change the world is one of the really fantastic things I really enjoyed about the play, I think.
Oh, thank you.
So one of the most compelling choices you made was to explore. We mentioned this briefly. Explore the complexity of class for most for most people, most of the characters in the play. Would you talk us through some of the features of class that you considered when writing the play?
Would I talk you through? Sorry, say that again.
The features of class that you considered when writing the play.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted, like I said before, I wanted to make it quite diverse. So in terms of, for me, the Luscars are the kind of the bottom of the pile. And what I find really interesting is even today, if you go to Brick Lane, for example, in East London to go and have a curry, a lot of the people that live around there are descended from the Luscars. So often they were like cooks and whatever on the boats, and they would jump ship at Tilbury Docks, and they basically settled in that area, and they married, and they had children, and all the rest of it. So they were very, very badly treated by it. I mean, they literally ran the British naval system until about 47. I mean, every single fleet had Indian sailors, not just Indian, there were Africans, there were Chinese, etc. But Indians made up the bulk of the workers there. And again, their stories are not told very much, even though we have got some written evidence of this, letters, etc., that some of them were literate. But the minute you have a whole society who are not literate, they're not writing down their history. They're not. We haven't got records in Parliament about them. We have little bits and pieces here and there, and that's the thing about working class history, which is quite hard. So, for example, the Ayers have got almost nothing written about them or written by them because they didn't read and write, basically. So for me, that was really important to tell their stories first and foremost, and also to, like I said before, to show the friendships that they had with English people as well, who were in the same. Because I mean, Victorian society was pretty awful for everyone that wasn't, wealthy. I mean, we know all this from Dickens and the workhouses and the factories and the child poverty and etc. It's very. There's a wonderful description by Gandhi when he comes over as a 19-year-old to Britain in 1889, and he walks around London and he talks about how poor some of the slum areas are where there are working class people living. And he's really, really shaken by it. And he describes it in quite a lot of detail. So I think that those stories for me were quite important to show. And to show the friendships, as I said.
Yeah. You said a lot about, there isn't a huge amount written down about Ayers and Lascars, etc. You did spend quite a lot of time while researching the play in the British Library. What was one of the interesting historical discoveries that you made that you featured in the play?
Oh, most of the historical discoveries, I have to say, have already been made. I was just like rummaging around, like it's actually got an India office library in the British Library. So there's lots of, I think for me, it was just things like reading, I can't remember the names of everything, but certainly I read a sort of like a memoir of a lady in waiting to Queen Victoria, and talking about what she had to do every day. And so that's what Lady Sarah was based on quite a lot. To be honest, a lot of the ladies in waiting talked about how boring life was and how all they had to do was stand around and hand over handkerchiefs, and they would often have to walk behind Queen Victoria when she went off on her jaunts to Balmoral, and it'd be freezing cold, and she would be in the coach, but they would be trudging along in their skirts. So it's all fascinating. For me, the most interesting place that I actually visited was Osborne House, which is in the Isle of Wight, and it's where Queen Victoria and Abdul Karim went. Not Abdul Karim, sorry, her husband Albert went to have their holidays, and then later on, Abdul Karim went with her to accompany her. And within Osborne House, there is a whole room which has been made in the fashion of a Indian darbar, which is like with that incredibly intricate Mughal style roof. There's a peacock throne there, like the Mughal emperors had. And on the walls, there are pictures, portraits of every single Indian servant ever worked for Queen Victoria. And there were hundreds of them. That's what was so interesting. And then the people at the Osborne House, they showed me the menu that Queen Victoria had for her dinner and she ate a lot every week. And every Friday night she had chicken curry made by Abdul Karim. And so that kind of stuff is quite interesting, isn't it? I don't think it's a particular historical discovery, but it was, it's all stuff that you can use for a play.
Yeah, something very sort of modern, multicultural about that. The idea of sort of like having a curry every Friday.
I know.
Yeah, it's interesting. Now, you mentioned briefly Lady Sarah, who's obviously one of the important characters in the play, Victoria's lady in waiting. There is quite a lot of tension between Victoria and Lady Sarah. Why did you want to present that tension?
So Lady Sarah is completely made up. She didn't exist. The actor playing Lady Sarah went off to try and find lots of information about her, and then came back looking a bit upset, saying, "I can't find anything about this woman." And I went, "That's because she doesn't exist. I just made her up." So she's basically like what happened during the reign of Queen Victoria when Abdul Karim came into her court was that he caused a constitutional crisis in that everybody, I mean, the real racism of the aristocracy was like absolutely came to head. They did not want this man in court. They did not want him anywhere near her. They literally thought he was going to try and assassinate her. They thought he was a lesser human being. All those, terrible, terrible racist tropes. So actually, Lady Sarah is an amalgamation of all those people in court. So she basically represents the whole of Victoria's court. Because otherwise, I would have had about another 30 characters coming in and out. So it's all on her. So she represents them. And I mean, I think that, to start with, to have her as a quite, friendly, benign sort of character, and then to show her growing hatred of Abdul Karim and also her growing resentment of him because he's basically taken over her job. She's no longer number 2, he is. And she's probably number 6 now. And as we know, I mean, we see it all the time in looking at The Crown, for example, the series, and looking at what goes on with Meghan Markle and all the rest of it, those kind of court intrigues were just as rife then as they are now. And interestingly, Queen Victoria gave Abdul Karim the gift of Frognall Cottage, which was also given to Harry and Meghan.
Yeah.
So, but neither of them have managed to stay there very long. So, yeah.
No, I think it's been given to another member of the royal family now, I think. Talking about that, I found really interesting with Lady Sarah is that when I went to see the revival that's currently on at the RSC, you made quite a few changes to the script for the revival. Yeah. And one of the things that I noticed particularly was actually that Lady Sarah became a more sympathetic character. It felt as if rather than she was pulling the strings, that the strings of the powerful men were being, of her strings were being pulled by them. I wanted to ask you sort of why what was your motivation for the changes that you made to the script for the revival that's happened this year?
It's interesting that that's how it comes across, because actually what I did when I changed it was to make those arguments even more vicious rather than less. And it's about what's great about having another production of the play is that it's about the different actors and what they bring to it. And so that's very much what Frankie Faridani, who plays Lady Sarah in this production, that's the way she chose to go, which is to make her more sympathetic, not necessarily to Abdul Karim, but to see her being a bit more torn by the decisions that she has to make, and also that she is representing Bertie, the Prince Edward, and also the rest of the court. And so she's the one that's having to get. She's the messenger basically, and that's how she plays it. And I think she does play it really beautifully. But actually, the changes show more conflict rather than less. So it's really interesting the way things shift, and it would be fascinating to see if there was another production how that Lady Sarah would be. But it's because otherwise, I think if you just played it as a nasty old goat, then there's not far to go. But if you play her slightly more sympathetically, you get more nuance and more characterization. It feels more real, I think, as well.
No, absolutely, I agree. The way that I interpreted it when I was watching it was just the case of sort of, again, a gender thing, I think, of sort of the men sort of like being in charge and control, and sort of like treating the women as puppets that they can do, they can use for whatever they want to use. And that's how I interpreted it. And yeah.
No, you're right. And they're both puppets, actually, aren't they? I mean, Queen Victoria is the biggest puppet of them all.
Yeah, well, I suppose arguably you could say that's what constitutional monarchy is, really.
Exactly. So, thank you.
So there are several intertextual references made in the play. Could you share your reflections on the music and poetry included in the play and the role that played to the story you were telling?
Yeah, I mean, I always like a bit of a song and a dance in the play. I mean, it's great to actually use some of the poetry of the day. Like, for example, Rudyard Kipling's White Man's Burden poem, which is so obnoxious, but is actually really, really illustrates how people felt about empire in terms of the British. So that was quite nice to set to music. And I wrote a extra verse, which was my version of in this production, which was my version of White Man's Burden, which is actually turning it on its head. And also the Luscars song. So I wanted to show some form of the fact that there was this Indian music that was sort of kind of similar to Irish as well. I think it just makes it more interesting as a form of entertainment, because that's what I always think about when I'm writing plays, is that I don't want to bore people. And you have to always think about, when you're writing, what are those actors doing on stage? They can't just stand around making speeches all the time. Well, then they do make speeches as well. So it's always nice to be able to kind of to actually have music and song and dance within that, because it just lifts it for an audience. But also we use some of the music of the day as well. I mean, I think the Lasker song was actually sung by a very, I don't know if anyone's heard of him before, but he was a very working class, I think he was Lancashire, artist called George Formby. And he used to play the ukulele and black and white films. And he sang the song, Bless Them All. But his version is much cleaner than my version is. So my version is basically the Indian Lasker version.
Yeah, I didn't know that George Formby had performed that.
Yeah,
that's interesting. I found this White Man's Burden that we mentioned. I remember coming across that when I was a teenager and thinking that it was a satire, the poem, because it's so on the nose.
Yeah.
It's so on the nose, and I think it sort of illustrates sort of a lot of the things that about colonialism and about sort of about racism and jingoism, that I think I find it it's really interesting. I think a lot of again studying that with my pupils, they found it really fascinating that there was this poet that was really popular, could be so on the nose about imperialism, could write a poem that was so so sort of obvious about sort of the sort of thing that he was trying to say. So that's really interesting. I think we are now going to come to questions from the audience. So let's see if we've got questions from the audience. Yes. So the first question I've got is, so there's a great text to use to teach about colonialism and empire. The player mutes a lot of narratives that are silenced. Can you comment on this silence and why you muted so many within one text? Why do you think it's important for us to know these parts of British history?
Yeah, that's a big question. So basically, I think there has been a sort of like movement to try and kind of tell history from a different perspective than the one that we've always been taught. And the thing that I'm always aware of, and I keep banging on about this, is that when I was at school studying history, I never learned any of this. Never. All I learned about was Tudors and Stuarts and the First and Second World War. I didn't even know that Indians had fought in the First World War. So there was nothing of me in my learning of history. When I say me, of my community, and yet there's so many of us here. And then, secondly, in English literature, I didn't read anything by anyone of colour. And it was only when I left school that I started to read people like Toni Morrison, etc. And then you're completely exposed to a whole new, different way of thinking. And I think that's what literature is so incredibly important at doing, which is about telling different stories, not always going along the same narrative. I mean, obviously, empire in a way is a terrible thing that happened to many people, and there is this whole argument at the moment going, oh, it wasn't so bad, at least the Indians got railways out of it and all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of right-wing backlash against it, and you see it a lot, and there's so much being written at the moment by David Olusoga, by Satnam Sanghera. I think Empire Land is now being studied at schools as well. And also the Empire podcast with Anita Anand and William Dalrymple, who were talking about a different, like from the perspective of the colonized, them telling their stories as opposed to always the English telling the story of what they thought was going on. And it is shocking. It is very shocking what happened. It was brutal. It was vicious. It was like certainly in India, millions of people died in famines. Certainly in the area that my family are from, which is Bengal, I think there was something like 4 million people died from famine in 1941, I think it was. And this was overseen by Winston Churchill. So, I mean, I could go on and on, but I think these stories, what I love about writing plays is that you can tell stories from the perspective of individual characters rather than, a very heavy looking non-fiction book, which, not many of us read. And so it's about being able to tell these stories, not necessarily in a harsh way, but to show that these people were human as well. And that it's about, we see it all the time around us as well, but it's also really interesting to see how people struggled when they came to this country and how people who lived here struggled as well.
Yeah, and I think you're right in terms of things, these stories being muted. Actually, we're not learning full British history. There's so much about British. If we're not learning those stories, then we're not. There's a lot that we're missing out on about British history as much as anything else. So another question. So there's so much British history to engage with through the play and the issues referenced. How have students and teachers engaged with you on some of the things more dominant narratives tend to erase?
How do they
how do they engage with you on some of the things more dominant narratives?
How do they engage with me? I don't know. They write to me, I guess.
Have you had many students and teachers sort of speaking to you since it's been put onto the?
No, not really. I've had a few Instagram messages, and I'm not very good on Instagram, so I never even know how to respond. But no, I haven't. And I think the problem is that that in terms of this being a play text, it's not a problem. The fact that it's on at the theatre is great. It means that people can come and see it and it becomes live, because plays aren't written to be just read. They're to be performed, and you see things in a performance that you wouldn't necessarily. I mean, how many of us have, when we were kids, went to see Shakespeare and then it all came to life because we didn't really understand it when we read it? So I think this is the big thing, is to try and get not just my play but other plays produced, and so that the students can go and see them. And the other thing is that with like, for example, going to schools and talking about the work, etc., the problem is that schools don't have the money to pay for anybody to go in or to get actors in. And the only people that seem to be able to ask me whether I will go and talk to them is private schools, because they have funding to pay for us. Otherwise, it's just impossible to engage on a one-to-one basis, with schools. And I think it is a problem, and it's hopefully through the RSC resources pack and all that kind of stuff, we can redress some of that with interviews and Zoom and all the rest of it. But it's not like the old days where you could get a writer in to come and talk to a class, because there is no funding for it. There's hardly any funding for students to even go and see a play. So it's not insurmountable, but there are difficulties around it.
It's a bit of a shame, really, that. But I'm sure things like this are really important ways of sort of trying to sort of help address that balance. You depict a gulf between Victoria and the people doing her imperial bidding. She could be interpreted as being sympathetic, opening to hearing how her imperial subjects around the world are treated through her relationship with Abdul Karim. Why did you do this?
Well, because I wanted to make Queen Victoria human, and I found her a fascinating character. However much I wanted to hate her, I couldn't. Most of what she says in the play is actually verbatim, so it's from her diaries. She was quite an interesting woman. She was incredibly educated. She could read in different languages. She was learning Hindi from Abdul Karim. She was very brilliant artist. I mean, some of the paintings I saw in Osborne House were actually painted by her. So even though I come from a family of, empire hating people, it's just like I kept coming back to the fact that she's quite an interesting woman, and maybe she is also a bit of a puppet, in that she never went anywhere. I think the furthest she travelled was actually to Nice in France. So there she was, the Empress of India, Empress of all of, India and various other African continent in the African continent, but she'd never stepped foot out of anywhere. And actually, a lot of her court were deposed Indian princes, deposed African princes, etc., etc. So she obviously had a thing about wanting to know her subjects. Having said that, she's still Empress of India, and she was the head of one of the most vicious empires out there. And I think that makes it quite interesting. It's not that I'm sympathetic to the crown or constitutional monarchy. I'm more sympathetic to her as a human being and her friendship with Abdul Karim, because that's the way in. Because I think also a lot of people come out of the show going, "Oh, she was great, wasn't she, Queen Victoria?" And I think, I'm not sure that's what I wanted to come across. I think that actually it's all there in that she, the stuff that is being done in her name is horrific. We mentioned Benin, we mentioned Uganda, we mentioned Rhodesia, we mentioned India as well. So these are things that are, if you read between the lines, you can see that she's, as a human being, she's sympathetic, but not what what's done in her name.
And there's an inherent contrast there between the sympatheticness of her character and the fact that she did have this close relationship with Abdul. She was, trying to learn as much about her empire, and yet the awful things that were being done in her name. So, and again, it's a really fascinating thing, that I think. You use lots of different languages in the play, and that obviously helps connect to, bring in different knowledge and value systems and cultures. Why do you think it was important to include the different languages that you did?
So different languages in Indian languages, or
so I assume that's what the question.
So in the new production, we actually have not used any different languages. So this play was originally written over 10 years ago, and now it feels, the times feel a bit different. So interestingly, in the first production in 2013, all the Asian characters had Indian accents. In this production, they don't have Indian accents, apart from when they're speaking to English people. And so for that reason, I took out all of the Indian language, because I thought, actually, if they were speaking to each other, if you have all your Luscars in one room together talking to each other, they wouldn't be speaking in an Indian accent. They would be speaking their own language. But we can't have them speaking their own language, because then nobody would understand what they were saying. So we actually took out all the language, Indian languages, just because it just felt like it wasn't really telling the right story. And I know certainly with my Caribbean friends as well, we often go into a little bit of patois every now and then. And the same with Indians, they often speak a sentence in their language. But I'm really, really conscious of not wanting to alienate anybody in the audience. I think the minute you start speaking in another language, people in the audience, some will get it and others will go, "What? I didn't get that." Because you can't have subtitles on the stage in the way that you can in film. Well, you can have subtitles, but that costs so much money that nobody wants to do it. So it's about performing for a modern audience, basically.
I found it quite interesting in the scene when I went to see it last month in the Aya home, where they're together, the Ayas, and they're talking with British accents, and then when the people come to tour the Aya home, they do drop it. You do quite notice quite a lot of them going into that sort of Indian
They
accent.
go into
I
their
find it
own
quite
language.
interesting.
I mean, and also I was very aware that when I was growing up, my parents had an Indian accent. But to me, I couldn't hear it. I couldn't see what everyone else was going on about, that they had this accent, because obviously we spoke Bengali at home, so I didn't really understand. And I remember very clearly somebody saying to me, "Oh, when your mum talks, I can't understand a word she says." And I remember thinking, she speaks fluent English. What is wrong with you? It's just an accent. And it's about how we're heard as opposed to who we are, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we probably have time for one more question. What other texts would you recommend for students or teachers to read alongside the Empress, and why?
Well, the one that I was talking about was Ayers, Luscars and Princes. So she was an Ilia teacher in the 70s, and she found it very frustrating that none of her Asian kids in her class knew anything about their history in this country. So she literally wrote the book. And so it's a very easy text to read, because it's not an academic book, which is probably why I read it, and it's got lots of great pictures in it. But it's a very brilliant book. And the other book I would say is Empire Land by Satnam Sanghera, which is also very accessible and tells the history as it is. Really.
Yeah, I've read that. It's brilliant.
Yeah.
Right, we have pretty much run out of time, so I think we're going to need to say goodbye. Thank you so much, Tanika, for talking to me. It's been a joy and an honour. So thank you very much. And I will hand you back to our hosts.
With the discussion during this secondary session of the first ever Lit in Colour teaching. So sorry for the technical issue there. We're back now. And I just wanted to say a huge thank you to everyone who's attended this first secondary session for the Lit in Colour Teacher Conference. We are going to be sending out the book bundles next month, so please make sure that you've scanned the QR code, you've entered in your details so that you can be entered into the prize draw. We have a number of free resources on the Lit in Colour pages of penguin.co.uk. They are also available on the Tes Black Experiences Hub Lit in Colour pages, so do make sure that you download them, engage with them. We've got videos from authors like Nazneen Ahmed Patak, who's going to be on later this afternoon, and other authors like Avni Doshi reading extracts, as well as activities to do with your students.
Also, don't forget to head over to the Twinkles Lit in Colour pages and the Tes Lit in Colour pages to find the accompanying resources for this event. There is a resource for City of Soul and Magic, the Empress, and Girl, Woman, Other that details some key features of each text if you're considering auditing and amending your curriculums to include one of these texts. The teachers from the reflective sessions have also kindly compiled some top tips that they considered while engaging with the process of diversifying their curriculum content. These tips are great for personal use and can also be shared with your departments. Following this session, we will send, your departments. There will be opportunities following this session, we will send an evaluation form as it's our first Lit in Colour teacher conference. We would really appreciate if you would fill it out so that we can use your feedback to inform our approach to future events. Thanks again for your time and your engagement, and thanks to Tes, our partner for this event. We hope you have a wonderful start to this new school year and are able to make some meaningful changes to your curriculum and classroom choices. If you're planning to join the primary session following this, you'll need to use the primary link on the email from Tes, and we look forward to seeing you at 2 p.m. Bye.